Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome back. Welcome back to day 2 of our research during epidemics workshop. We've had some great feedback already from day 1, so we're really glad that people have enjoyed that. And we're looking forward to another really good 2 sessions this morning, or perhaps it's going to be afternoon by then, wherever you are. So you're all very, very welcome. Um, just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. I think you know the drill, but let's just go through it. So just reminding you, this workshop's being recorded and it's going to be shared on the global health platforms. A few people were asking yesterday, how are we going to get hold of the talks, etc. Don't worry, they're all going to be there, and the recordings on the Global Health Network platform. Probably, hopefully, that will be put up before Christmas, so you'll be able to enjoy that. If you would like a certificate of attendance for this workshop, you do need to attend at least 80%, and you will need to complete a workshop evaluation. That's going to be in the chat box later, but it will be sent to you via email. As you know from yesterday, we have disabled your microphones and your videos so that things run smoothly, so we don't get interruptions. But if during discussion, the chair of the session is going to ask you a question, if you've asked a question and for you to join in the discussion, then Global Health Network can make sure that we can see you and they can enable your microphone. So just a little reminder, there's 2 ways that we can communicate with each other here. There's 2 different sort of chat boxes, and one of them is actually called chat, and that's what it's for, it's to chat. And I can see a few people have already posted this morning. It's a nice way to say hi, who you are, let's introduce, let's get to know each other. It's a good way to network with each other. But of course, these talks and presentations are opening up a lot of questions. We want to have some really good discussions today. We had some wonderful interactive discussions yesterday. So please, for your questions, put those in the question and answer box, not in the chat box. So you can see the question and answer has 2 little speech bubbles for question and answer. So just try and do that. We will try and monitor those just to see if anything does go in the wrong box, then we can move it. Okay. We will be posting some links as we go on. There will be lots of things that are going on the Pandora Knowledge Sharing Hub, so I'd really encourage everybody to take a look at that as well. We have got 1 or 2 slight changes to the programme this morning, but the basic premise is the same, that we're going to have 2 sessions. The first session is going to be on biobanking in epidemics. After that, we'll have a short 15-minute break, and then we'll have a session on ethics review in epidemics, and then we'll have a sort of overall discussion before we finish for the day. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague in Zimbabwe, Blessing Silaigwana, to introduce the session 3 and our chair for session 3. So over to you, Blessing.
Thank you, Max, for that nice introduction and welcome. So hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Just like yesterday, for those of you who attended, we have a really packed agenda today with 2 sessions. So the first one is on biobanking, and then the second one is on ethics review during epidemics. And I really hope that everyone is excited, just like yesterday, and looking forward to hearing the stimulating and insightful presentations from our, variety of panelists and chairs who are really experts in this field of research ethics from different countries across Africa. So without further ado, I'd like to now invite the session chair for our first session on biobanking, Professor Ames Dye. Professor Ames Dye she served as the founder and director of the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics at Wits University in South Africa, and she's currently serving as the specialist ethicist in the office of the president and CEO of the South African Medical Research Council. Professor Amisdai's CV is too long for me to try and narrate all her accolades and honors. But without further ado, I'd like to invite you to proceed with our first session of the day. Over to you, Ames. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Blessing, for your kind introduction. And good morning, colleagues. It's really exciting to see so many of you back here. And welcome to our session on biobanking. I think to start off with, just a few words on biobanking. And, and what I'd like to say is that research involving human genetic and genomic information, which is analyzed together with other personal or health data for understanding of multifactorial diseases, is really important. It's important globally, and it's important for us here in Africa as well. And this research has increased significantly over the past few decades. One of the ways in which to advance this research is through storage of tissues, human biological materials, and data in biobanks. But this comes with a catch. The open and evolving nature of biobanks has profound ethical, legal, and social implications for individual autonomy and for group autonomy. Secondary use samples and data review over time, data sharing, etc., and the list goes on and on. Also, complexities in international collaborations where laws, national laws are different, are a problem. And what we find is implementing national laws in an internationally inconsistent way is also highly problematic. So how do we balance this? The importance of the need for this biobank research or research using biobanks with the ethical, legal, and social issues. What does this mean for us in Africa, especially as we are steeped in tradition and culture? And how do our African indigenous values towards the common good would be used to apply to research from biobanks? And more particularly so now in the context of epidemics. This morning we've got excellent presenters, we've got experts to assist us and take us forward on these issues from our continent, and they're going to share their views with us on this. We will start off with a discussion followed by, a presentation followed by a panel discussion. The presentation will be done by Mr. Aminu Yakubu, and the panel discussion will include Blessing Silaigu and Leah Aruda, both of them really doing lots of work in biobanks as well. Aminu Yakubu is a Fogarty African Bioethics Training Program alumni and honorary research fellow at the Center for Bioethics and Research in Ibadan, Nigeria. He has worked for the Nigerian National Health Research Ethics Committee to provide guidance to research and ethics committees on conducting ethical research in Nigeria. The title of his talk is, "How Should Biobanking Be Governed in Low Resource Settings?" Over to you, Aminu. Looking forward to hear what you have to share with us. Over.
Thank you, Ames. And thanks, Blessing. That was a wonderful introduction, Professor Ames. And it's really a pleasure to be able to say a word or two on this topic about governing biobanks in low resource settings. So what I will be sharing with us is really going to be, some highlights that give us in general, highlights about, some of the thoughts that I share about how biobanks need to be governed in low resource settings, but especially African countries, and along the lines, of course, of the introduction that Professor Ames mentioned earlier, which are really critical, as it were. So I will share my slides. Okay. So I would start with this question: why biobanking? And I think this is probably almost intuitive. The value that biobanks bring to furthering science are actually enormous. Whereas historically, research studies are being conducted as specific research, whereby once you conduct that research, you have the samples and you report the findings. With biobanking, it helps to optimize the utility of valuable samples, because in genomics research, I think the strength that genomics research brings to science is allowing, through biobanking, different researchers to pull in either data and or samples in order to power discovery of insights, whereas generating that data or an amount of samples needed to generate those type of insights would require too much money and probably take too long a time to complete. With biobanking and sharing of samples between one biobank and the other, or sharing of samples through biobanks between researchers, it makes it possible to ensure that the utility of samples are optimized. So one sample collected today for a research in Nigeria, it could have utility for some other multinational research, if you would like, wherein genomic samples are pulled from different African countries and from actually different global populations, so as to be able to create or generate insights. And again, like I mentioned, what it does, then it also ensures that to some extent, whereas if one was to require those same samples from Nigeria, if in the absence of biobanks, fresh data or sample collection would be needed. Through biobanking, there is sort of reduction in the burden of sample collection from participants in a given area. Some of us that are sort of involved in research, there is this tendency for researchers to identify a certain community, whereas it is almost always to that community that those researchers go back to whenever there are new research studies, for a number of reasons. For example, ease of access, or also because of the research awareness of that community. So in a number of instances, when you see research institutes or universities, you see that they have established a set of communities to which they have been conducting research over years. And it's easy for other collaborators that want to do research in those countries to also tend to want to go to those communities. But through biobanking, you're able to reduce the burden from sample collection from participants, because then as long as those samples are viable, they are of good quality, and you can collaborate with the biobanks storing those samples, you could go and ask for those samples depending on how they meet your study inclusion criteria, to be able to do your research without having to go back to the primary participants to collect the samples again, as it were. And I have mentioned the issue of facilitating access to data from diverse populations, which is really important in order to be able to create insights. We are all aware, of course, of the growing evidence or growing discovery of the value of diversity inclusion in genomics research, which is including diverse populations. As we know, what the data tells us at the moment is that more than 97% of the data available for genomics research is actually from Caucasian populations, and just about 3 is from other diverse populations, including Africans. Even though we are aware now that the modern man originated from Africa sometime last year. That discovery was even narrowed down to somewhere in Botswana or in the region of Botswana, Southern Africa. So that's an important discovery. And the idea is that it is the case or the expectation that there is more the genes that you find in indigenous African populations is probably holds much more of the genomic history of humans than other populations that had emigrated more than 200,000 years ago out of Africa, with of course the potential that their genetic makeup may have been affected through movements and through changes in lifestyle and other factors that affect our genetic makeup, as the case might be. One critical thing about the importance of biobanking, of course, is enabling reproducibility. In research, one of the key things, as we are aware, is that one of the key values in research, or one of the things that actually kind of really holds science together, is researchers being able to interrogate the work of each other. And it is really when research studies are reproducible that then those results become more reliable and as such more embedded in science than otherwise. Because any research study that is not reproducible, that is scientific, it's a questionable research, as it were. And really, like I said, is one of the core things that hold science together. Then the other, of course, which is the ultimate aim of biobanks, is enabling the improvement of health and saving lives, as the case may be. We have all followed the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. And it is the sharing of plagues of the SARS-CoV-2 virus across the globe, I think, in my opinion, that had facilitated the speed at which the discovery was able to be made, as it were, which is really important. So we're now at the cusp of having COVID-19 vaccines, which is very likely to continue to improve saving of lives, in addition to what the current treatment regimen or current management regimen, because I'm not sure there is therapy at the moment, is for COVID-19. So it is only through what the science of biobanking, I would argue, has made possible that we're able to achieve this speed in development of the COVID-19 vaccines. And really, it is through that we are optimistic that through biobanking research, that science will be fast-tracked, whereas, like I mentioned, it would have taken decades to be able to go to different parts of the world to collect data, to collect samples. It shortens the lifespan from bench to a product. So having said that, what are the ethical issues with biobanking in lower middle income countries? And really this thing for me is really that the novelty of biobanking research lies in the promise of data and sharing samples, which I've mentioned earlier, and really therein also interestingly lies most of the ethical issues. For folks in Africa, one of the critical issues has to do with fairness in research collaboration. Interestingly, there is very low investment in research in lower middle income countries by the governments of those countries. And as such, to a greater extent, the diseases bedeviling those or people from those countries have to some extent been left out without, in-depth research to be able to find solutions to the health problems of the people in those regions. Now, what then happens is that most of the research studies being conducted in those parts of the world, or in our parts of the world, because it's really our parts of the world, is being funded by people from either research institutes or grants from developed countries. Now, therein lies part of the ethical issue, or really an important aspect of research collaboration, including in the field of genomics. So hitherto, one of the things that has been an issue is the thought that it is only after the science or the thought has been concluded on what needs to be done and how it needs to be done that collaborators from research from low middle income countries are then identified, and the expectation from them is really just to run with the protocol, get it approved, and collect the data. Some have called that equivalent to making research or scientists from lower middle income countries as mere glorified data collectors, not involved in the scientific thought that is leading to discoveries, as the case might be. And it doesn't stop there alone. One of the other issues is also the potential that involvement in publication of the findings from those studies is also seen as a tokenistic, it's also seen to be tokenistic for the African research or researchers from the LMICs, as the case might be, in that perhaps they are not also allowed or empowered to lead the development of those publications. So their names appear somewhere there on the author list rather than being empowered, whereas they had led the data collection, in those countries to really be leaders in the drafting of those publications, as the case might be. Now, that's just talking about the primary publications coming from the primary research studies. Another issue about fair research collaboration, of course, has to do with use of the data collected or samples already collected for secondary research due to limited funding and other limited access to other resources that facilitate research. For example, researchers from LMICs are less capable or are less able to interrogate or engage with the data that has been collected for secondary research purposes, as the case might be. So, for example, in a number of institutions that we have, you will find out that access to resource materials, either books or journals, is limited, for a number of researchers from LMICs. Not just that, even the speed and the strength of the internet they would require, for example, to source for some of those materials that are out there online is another issue. Another critical issue people also struggle with is power. One might have to buy a small generator set and use it to fuel that generator set in order to consistently be able to work on their systems, in order to be able to do research or to meet up to the sort of expectations they have when there is a sort of international research collaboration. Apart from that, when we talk about use of samples, capacity to also analyze the samples is also something of a concern in LMICs. You know, capacity, for example, for whole genome sequencing or for whole genome genotyping is a lot limited in a number of research institutes in LMICs. And not just that, but even the capacity to interrogate the data from the sequences that have been generated is also critically wanting. So that really limits the ability of researchers from LMICs to be fairly engaged in international research collaboration. And this is an ethical issue that has been said to be really important, which I also consider critically important, that in international research collaborations, efforts are important to be able to look at how this gap can be much, closed as much as possible. I understand that we had a very important and useful discussion around informed consent yesterday. So it's really at the crux of the matter, you know. What consent model should be the most suitable one that we can use in our countries, in LMICs? Is it a broad consent model that works best for us, or is it a tiered consent that works best for us? Or is it just specific consent that works best for us? In an event where there are different regulations in different countries as to what consent model works best, and not just in terms of regulations, there are also different cultural and social issues or perceptions in different countries that also kind of tend to dictate what consent model is most acceptable to a given population. I think that's a critical issue that needs to be discussed, and how in doing research, scientists, whether local or international collaborators, are able to engage and adopt a suitable consent model that works best for the different populations. But one thing that's also important in genomics research, since I have mentioned that one of the key novelty of genomics research is that of data and sample sharing, it's important to find a middle ground in informed consent models that also, while protecting local interests or local country interests, that it also facilitates sharing of data and samples in order to, for the greater good, I would argue, as the case may be. Very related to that data sharing is, how do we share the data? Which data sharing model would work best for LMICs or LMIC scientists? Is it going to be open data sharing model, or is it restricted data sharing model, as the case might be? And it's important to be able to also strike, like I said, a middle ground that both protects local country scientists and while also fostering the development of science in itself. Ownership of data and samples is also critical, and this has come up a number of times. Who owns samples and who owns the data? Is it the participants that have contributed the samples that own the samples and data? Or are samples really a global good, since we all share the same genes 99% of the times as human beings? Is the data from genomics research rather a global good, or is it something that is owned by the research participants? How is that argument settled, as the case might be? Of course, I've mentioned the issue of secondary data use. Then another important issue is that of benefits and benefit sharing. So what are the benefits that come out, or that LMIC researchers or research participants or institutions or communities should expect from genomics research. And there's a huge ongoing debate about what constitutes benefits in genomics research. One of the key issues is really the concern that a lot of genomics research is basic science. It's really generating insights and trying to find out, whether there are new insights that can enable better disease management or perhaps development of new medications or diagnostics. So a lot of genomics research is really at that discovery stage in terms of new knowledge to improve science. But of course, I personally argue that having the knowledge itself isn't enough until that knowledge is able to or what is optimal. While having knowledge is very important, what is most optimal is if that knowledge is able to inform policy change or development of new medications or diagnostics that are able to further improve the health of individuals. And in that comes some of the other considerations about benefit sharing in terms of, okay, what then happens if the utility of research goes beyond just knowledge, but it also includes commercialization of the findings, whereby some of the users of that data are able to get some profit from the proceeds of a research. How are benefits discussed in that, in that circumstance, and who benefits in that circumstance as well? Lastly, and not the least, is the return of results. So in genomics research, a number of results, I think, become available, including point of care results, which are all chemistry results or microbiology results, in addition to genomics results, because one of the ways to make better use of the findings from genomics studies is being able to understand the underlying health conditions of the participants, as it were, not just what you see in the genes, but also what was it that they had as underlying conditions. So some genomics research studies also include, running, for example, tests for sugar, running tests for wellness of kidneys or wellness of how the body uses fats and oils, as the case might be. And it's in those discoveries that one is able to establish, ab initio, the health condition that participants may have, and then be able to also tie it with the genetic findings to see whether there's something in their genes that tells about their predisposition to those diseases or their ability to better manage those diseases or their response to drugs for those diseases, as the case might be. So which results to return to participants, those chemistry or microbiology results and or genomics findings, and how and by whom? These are critical ethical questions. So what happens with the void in governance? The issue of parachute research, I think it's something that we all are aware of, which I've mentioned earlier, and which came to, I don't want to say to light, but which was heightened during the 2015 Ebola pandemic or epidemic in Western Africa. Whereas a number of researchers from other developing countries were accused of collecting samples from the African countries affected by the Ebola epidemic without any recourse to any governance mechanism of how they should take those samples, on what accounts are they taking those samples, or what conditions they're taking those samples. Of course, the discussion about ownership of the samples was also an issue, as the case is. So there was a lot of concern by a number of those African countries that samples have been taken. They don't know who took those samples. They are not sure where those samples have been taken to. You know, and of course, they also were concerned about, you know, if any discovery were to be made from the use of those samples, whether the people of those countries from whom samples were collected would benefit in any way from those samples. I mean, this is another, of course, concern, you know, looking at the fact that it's perhaps some people see it as another different form of colonialism. And it's still the issue of imbalance in power play that people perceive between when researchers from developed countries come to do research in developing countries, whereas the issue of parachute research remains persistent. You know, it's a concern. Sometime last year, or the issue about, you know, major laboratory in UK misusing African DNA was also brought to the fore. And these are all concerns, and I think they are also embedded in history of exploitation. And I think it's maybe another way of saying it also is a long-standing history of imbalance in research collaboration, unfairness in research collaboration, as the case might be. So I think with the governance mechanism, some of these or all of these issues would be addressed either with the beginning of that governance regime, or as that governance regime becomes more grounded, as the case is. And why I say as the case is because the whole idea about governance of biobanks is generally evolving, and it is much more a nuanced issue or a new issue to LMIC countries, because the data shows that there is very little in terms of what obtains in terms of, you know, governance of biobanks, or governance of research, as it were, in those countries. So it might not be an immediate, you know, solution to all of these issues, but it's something that over time, when the governance regime takes hold and becomes solidified, then we might be able to see, you know, almost total non-occurrence of some of these concerns in the future. So what does the governance regime achieve? I think what it helps to put in place is the issue of transparency. What it does is it holds biobanking and genomics researchers to a, you know, a principle or requirement or an obligation of transparency, for them to be able to be transparent in terms of exactly what it is they want to do in the research, how they are going to be managing the samples, how they're going to be managing the data. All needs to be out there in a governance regime. So that sets a requirement and expectation from all folks that are coming to do genomics research to say, well, look, we have to see, you know, transparency and understand better exactly what it is you're able to do, or what it is you're intending to do, and how you want to do that, and how that also affects the people and the society that you are involving in those research studies. Another issue is that of accountability, because then with transparency, once people understand exactly what it is that researchers want to do, then of course, in order to let people understand whether you are actually doing those things, is the issue of accountability. So being able to report on you know, the progress of the study, being able to demonstrate how, or the systems and mechanisms that the researchers have put in place to achieve the aims and objectives of the study in a way that still ensures the protection of the research participants, or that ensures the protection of the interests of the LMIC research collaborators, is critical and very important. And the third issue that a governance regime helps to put in place is that of oversight. While indeed research studies hold scientists to a high level of integrity, there is, of course, the need to have some oversight mechanism to still look inwards to see whether the things that researchers say they have want to do and that they have done, that they have actually done it, and in line with whatever regulatory approval it is that they have received to be able to do that. And once we're able to have these elements, because the oversight is the kind of an assurance mechanism for the public that an independent mechanism outside of the research infrastructure has been able to verify and substantiate that these researchers are indeed doing what they said they would be doing. And I think that together works to build trust. And once there is trust in a research collaboration or research partnership, that is more likely to lead to long-term sustainable research partnership than otherwise. So some folks have talked about models of governance and looked at two main models: state-backed models and institution-supported models. In state-backed models, I think that has worked, for example, in areas or countries where there are national biobanks and the country sets out a legislation or some sort of documentation to guide the operation of that national biobank, as the case might be. And as such, the state itself is invested in ensuring the functionality of the biobank and the degree to which the biobank also achieves its objectives. And it's through those instruments of legislation that is better achieved. However, in a number of other countries, and especially in most LMICs, there are no national biobanks, and neither are there comprehensive guidelines for genomics and biobanking research. So most of the regulation of biobanking research is actually grown institutionally. So for example, it will be the University of Wits, Witwatersrand in South Africa, that would have developed its own governance mechanism for biobanking research. And for example, let's say Wits has a biobank in some part of the institution, and researchers in Wits are conducting research, and keeping samples in those biobanks and being able to share those samples with other researchers, either within South Africa or other parts of the world. It is that mechanism that the institution develops that helps to guide how those samples are collected, stored, and shared, as it were. But what those institutional governance models do in the absence of national governance guidelines or regulations is to both grow internally what is in alignment with what is out there as best practice, as it were, in the absence of national studies. Whereas if there are national studies, of course, one of the first obligations or expectations is they will ensure alignment with those national studies and policies, while also aligning with global best practices, since they are involved in international research. Of course, then they develop also institutional policies and standard operating procedures that enables researchers in those institutions or that are collaborating with those institutions to be able to also apply and ensure alignment with those institutional guidelines. So I think I have already said this. So what is typically the governance structure, or how for biobanking in LMICs? How does it really look? And from the best of what I understand is that there's very little documentation in how biobanks are governed in LMICs. And there is, of course, limited regulation for genomics and biobanking research. So what you find is, institutions focusing on, say, informed consent and not paying much attention to sample sharing, as the case might be, so very, limited regulations. And available regulations are also not comprehensive enough to address ethical concerns. And this is what a lot of scientists or biobanking researchers have said. The study done by Yantina, where guidelines from 22 LMIC countries were reviewed, found out that actually no one country had a comprehensive national country-level guideline or policy on genomics and biobanking research. And that's really an important finding. They did find out, of course, that 3 countries, Malawi, South Africa, and Nigeria, had something in way of a guideline that for a guideline that you can look into and say this is a guideline governing genomics research and biobanking. For Malawi and Nigeria, those guidelines were addendums to what one would consider like a national guideline on research ethics. So there's a 1 pager or half a page or half a paragraph saying this is what you do in terms when you want to do biobanking research. In the case of Nigeria, what that was at the time was a policy on establishing and operating biobanks, and also indicating the fact that broad consent and not open consent is acceptable as a model of consent for biobanking research, as it were. So really this finding is critical, and I haven't in my search for literature found any updates on improvement over the study that was done in 2017, and I dare say that much has happened since then. So, but looking at the availability of best practice guidelines, looking at the availability of what the literature says and our experiences, what should the biobank governance regime in LMICs cover? And I've mentioned in my introductory remarks or in my introductory slides, one key important issue is really fair collaboration. And by fair collaboration is really being able to have collaborators from developing countries taking collaborators in LMIC countries as peers, as people that have the capacity to intellectually engage in the idea that is being thought of or that needs to be researched, and being given and empowered and to be able to contribute to that scientific thought from the conception or conceptualization of the idea to implementation and to post primary research outcome utilization, as it were. So collaborations to improve fairness should include empowering research participants, or research scientists from LMICs to be able to also engage in secondary data use and any other secondary data use plans that the researchers might already have from the inception. Informed consent, I think it's very important. So there's a lot of debate indeed, whereas even within LMICs, some have argued on the importance of broad consent as the consent that LMICs should consider adopting, because it is argued as a mechanism that best allows for data and sample sharing compared to otherwise, for example, specific consent. But there are other researchers that also argue that perhaps a tiered consent model is what is most appropriate. And there are discussions about, how best or which model to best adopt. And I think the key point here, it has to be a model that is socially and culturally acceptable. And even the process for obtaining the consent has to also be socially and culturally acceptable to the different countries, as the case might be. And whatever model is selected, whatever model is chosen, should be able to protect the participant or community of interest or interest of the community and the participants, while also being supportive of sharing plans. Because the issue is that without being able to share, considering the limited capacity in African countries to take research from knowledge to a product or translating knowledge to practice, collaboration with folks that have some of those resources is really important. But then that has to be done fairly, and that has to be done in a way that recognizes and respects, the country regulations and models of informed consent that are espoused by relevant authorities in those countries. A governance model should also be able to take care of concerns related to data and sample sharing. In that, clarity on privacy and confidentiality protections are necessary. Now, privacy and confidentiality concerns are important in genomics research because of the risk of stigmatizing finding, as it were, and how that finding is managed by the researchers in such a way that still protects the research participants in the LMICs, as the case might be. So that's really very critical. It's important that data and sample sharing regime for biobanks in LMICs have caveats that promote balancing of power and opportunities between northern and southern researchers. And what do I mean by that? I've already mentioned the issue of unfairness in collaboration. When a study is being done with LMIC and there's data that has been generated and there's secondary use of that data or samples, what is important is that governance regime should be able to find some protection for the LMIC scientists in such a way that tends to balance out some of their limitations in access to resources to publish or to utilize the data or samples, in a manner and time frame that folks in developed countries would have done much faster because of access to, better resources, for the lack of a better statement. So what does that mean again? For example, some researchers or some groups that have put in place governance mechanism, for example, the H3 Africa, what they have done is to be able to state that, when we do research with African collaborators, there has to be a period of moratorium that allows first the African scientists to interrogate and to engage with the data before that data is made accessible to other researchers that are not within that research consortium. That's one way of having a caveat that promotes the balancing of power. But I think what is also very important is that in all data and sample sharing plans, there has to be respect for agreements and consent provisions. So we all know that data and sharing sample plans have to be supported with material transfer agreements or data transfer agreements that are agreed to mutually by the collaborating institutions. There is also the risk already, because of the perception or the history of imbalance of power, that scientists in LMICs probably don't have the capacity, or even their institutions have the capacity to adequately negotiate the terms of an MTA, that's the material transfer agreement, or the DTA, that's the data transfer agreement, to the benefit of the scientists in those LMICs, and of course, to the benefit of science. That capacity, if it isn't there, I think there is a responsibility to have a governance mechanism that holds collaborators from developed countries to support those institutions to build that capacity for that sort of negotiation, as the case might be. We know that that's probably difficult because they come with interest, but we want to believe that the global interest that we share between LMIC researchers and researchers from wealthier countries have the same goal, which is that of improving the health of humanity or health of humans. And it is in that common vision that we share that we believe that all other interests will be set aside to ensure that there is capacity in those LMIC countries to be able to negotiate upon terms that are mutually agreeable, rather than really just endorsing those MTAs because there is a feeling that if I don't endorse this MTA, I'm going to probably lose this collaboration, and that will be a loss to myself as a researcher and a loss to my institution and probably a loss to my people. I think that sort of negotiation needs to be an informed negotiation for those agreements. And I think any governance regime needs to have mechanisms in place that ensure respect for those agreements, and as the case might be. Then the issue of benefit sharing. It's like I mentioned earlier, benefits sharing, when you look at what we are mostly used to in genomics research, which is really that of knowledge generation, is something that is being debated. But what has been recommended is there has to be considerations for monetary and non-monetary options. So some of the issues that people have mentioned that could serve as benefit is, excuse me, having or including in research collaborative partnerships, how institutions and individuals in LMICs can be empowered so that maybe the next round of grants, they are the ones leading the grant development or writing, rather than the grants having been applied for and obtained by a researcher from a developed country, and he or she is looking for collaborators, but rather building capacity for those African scientists that perhaps in the next round of grant applications, they will be the ones to lead the grant writing and be able to then lead the research study, and then they will be the ones looking for collaborators rather than the other way around. Some of the other issues that have been also suggested for benefit sharing is that of technology transfer. So as much as possible, if there is some form of technology that can be transferred that either facilitates research in the collaborating LMIC institution, or that helps to improve health of communities or individuals from the LMIC countries, is perhaps one consideration. But one other very important consideration that I think is that there is need in benefit sharing to have a mechanism that empowers and promotes the interests of host and donor country scientists, which I think I've already mentioned. There are, of course, some other considerations. So, for example, the WHO had stated or recommended that where there is profit to be made from the use of data or sample, perhaps there should be a proposal of bringing back between 1% to 3% of the proceeds after tax from that profitable venture to the LMIC countries. Now, the debate is, who should that go to? Should that go to the individuals that participated, or should that go to some authority in that institution or in that country that then decides how to perhaps then distribute or utilize that benefit to either improve health or to improve science in that country? The last one is that of the feedback of results. And the issue is whether results should be fed back. and what type of results should be fed back. Earlier on, I mentioned that there could be not only genomic results, but also point of care results. I think from my experience currently, I think I'm involved in a number of research studies locally here in Nigeria. There seems to be an interest from communities, people in the community, to want to know the results from point of care tests. People want to know whether they have high blood pressure. So if part of the test that was done included collecting high blood, measuring high blood pressure, they want to know. If it included testing for blood sugar in the field, people want to know, whether they're okay or not. Interestingly, because of the growth of non-communicable diseases, there seems to be some level of community level awareness, about these diseases. Of course, being called different terms in different local settings, but people still want to know whether somebody has sugar. And maybe that's colloquially how that is explained. Or somebody has high blood pressure, and maybe to understand what they can do with that. The other critical concern, of course, is then that of genomic findings. It's a bit more nuanced to feedback genomic findings. And what the literature has argued out there, what scientists and researchers are arguing, is that to be able to consider whether to return findings from genomics research, so it's genomic findings to research participants, critically two issues have to be considered. One is that of the utility of the finding clinically, because, so for example, people that have Alzheimer's disease, the apolipoprotein E4 has been discovered as a marker that tells about the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, the issue with that, though, is that identifying that only tells about risk. It does not truly diagnose Alzheimer's disease. So what that means is that it's not everybody from whom apolipoprotein E4 has been found that you would say would eventually go ahead to develop Alzheimer's disease. Rather, it's just some. So even when you know that this is indicative of risk, but then there is no treatment for Alzheimer's disease, as in something that you will take that will cure somebody from Alzheimer's disease, that doesn't exist. So the issue there is probably there is no clinical actionability. So clinically, even if you know somebody is at risk, clinically, what can you do to treat somebody that has a certain condition? The case might be that for a certain genomic finding, there's nothing that can be done because there's no treatment for that condition. So some people have argued that where there is no clinical utility and or actionability, should you really return results? And some have argued that perhaps you should, because some consider it to have some social value. So for example, in the case of Alzheimer's disease, some people might say, well, even if there is no treatment, but perhaps I could then put up an advance directive to say, should I, by some hard luck, be one of those that eventually go ahead to develop Alzheimer's disease, I want to write how I would like to be treated when I become cognitively impaired, as the case might be. In that instance, some people say it might have social value for them because it might allow them to then plan their lives, or at least inform other people in their families so that people might be able to take better health-seeking behavior, as it were, or maybe better lifestyle behaviors, as it is. But then interpreting the findings from genomic tests that have been done is something that is really requires understanding of the meaning of, those findings, as the case might be. And what has been recommended is that there has to be people that are trained as genetic counselors to do that. But then we have very limited genomic counselors globally, not just in LMICs, but more especially in LMICs. So what do we do when we don't have genomic counselors? I think biobank governance guidelines need to be able to stipulate what can be done. Some people have recommended that perhaps you could train some frontline healthcare workers through some, abridged training to allow them to be able to understand what those specific findings from the genomic studies mean, and to be able to serve them as counselors, even as the country continues to develop a professional cadre of genetic counselors. But then it is the decision of the authorities putting up this governance to even determine whether they want genomic findings to be fed back, or they probably just don't want that, and maybe define how else they would like genomic findings to be fed back. They could decide maybe they just want those findings to be put in a national archive of, health conditions for which there is genomic marker that has been identified among different populations in those countries, and wait until maybe they have the capacity to have genetic counselors before they would begin to allow genomic results to be fed back. Again, deciding on a governance model is something that is local, that is political in itself, and there's also social and cultural considerations, as the case might be. So these are some things that need to be considered in general when these decisions are to be taken, as the case might be.
Aminu?
So these
Sorry, are you almost done?
Almost time?
Yes, we run out of time.
I think I have just one or two slides left.
I'd really appreciate it if you fast tracked those slides. We've got lots of questions.
Not a problem. I have just one or two slides left.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So what are those enabling or supporting instruments? I've mentioned there are national frameworks which countries would need to be able to develop in order to guide the governance regime. There are institutional policies and SOPs that might be needed to guide, the biobanking operations. There are also oversight mechanisms that institutions might need to put in place. So, for example, ethics review committees and also biobank oversight committees. And these are typically things that are established by institutions, where you have, a data access and sample access committee, where you have an executive or steering committee. People also need to put in place total quality management systems for their biobanks. One key critical instrument in biobank governance is also, because if a biobank is not providing reliable and quality samples, it's probably not a biobank that should be recognized. So there needs to be certification or standardization of that biobank, and there are different options about how that can be done, whether with the new ISO 20387 certification, or before that, people can look at the IAC Common Minimal Technical Standards in defining how their biobanks are set up. Of course, they need trained personnel, which is critical as well. There are a number of useful biobank governance frameworks that different LMICs could refer to when thinking about developing a governance framework. One of them is the H3 Africa Framework for Governance of Genomic Research and Biobanking in Africa, which has put forward some core principles and a number of elements. And in the elements, it's really trying to get governments to think about African intellectual leadership, the appropriate consent model to be used, how community engagement can be prioritized and promoted, role of ethics committees in local countries in both primary research and secondary research, how to avoid group harm in publications from genomic findings with studies that have been conducted with communities, issues of benefit sharing, and all the other issues that I've mentioned actually earlier. Another very interesting and very recent framework is that one issued by the World Economic Forum which is the Genomic Data Policy Framework and ethical, and they also provide ethical tensions that people should consider. So they have foundational elements which are really core and probably the same with what I have mentioned earlier: consent, data privacy, data access, and benefit sharing. But what this also does, interestingly, is to be able to take a number of ethical tensions and raise a number of questions that then lead people interested in developing governance mechanism to answer those questions within their local context. And I think that is what would lead them eventually to agree on what works best for them in developing the foundational elements of the consent, data privacy, data access, and benefit sharing. So some points on regulation, and I think I agree with these, that there has to be rational compliance requirements on regulations, which is policies and legal requirements for data sharing and biobanking should facilitate research and not impose unnecessary obligations on the research community. And they have to be flexible because research and technology advancement is ever increasing. Therefore, governance mechanisms should reasonably be flexible to accommodate these developments, as the case might be. These are just some resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aminu, for such a comprehensive overview. It was an excellent presentation. In ethics, when we draw on justice, we start off by saying all things being equal. And you started off by showing us how all things are still unequal. And in terms of governance, because we have not stepped up to the party in terms of developing our governance, have allowed ourselves to be exploited. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We'll now go into the panel discussion, and I'm going to ask Leah and Blessing to join in. There are so many questions. I think we're going to do a deep dive into the questions immediately. You talked about informed consent and the different types of consents, and there's a concern that's been raised that LMICs participants are largely non-literate, and consent sometimes is delivered in non-written languages. So there's a huge concern about the participants' understanding of biobank research. Could this be jargon for them? And there are quite a few other considerations about consent. So I'm going to ask you, Aminu, in fact, I think I'm going to give you a break. And I'm going to ask Blessing and to start off with a response on how one should handle consent. And then Leah could come in if necessary. So Blessing, over to you. Blessing?
Sorry, Ames. Sorry, I missed that part of the question. I'm just, having a slow internet. Can you please repeat the question again?
So when we talk about consent and we talk about the different types of consent, but most of our participants are largely non-literate. So what do they understand about biobank research? How, are there ways in which we could try to facilitate this understanding? Because currently it seems to be like jargon. Any ideas you could share with us, Blessing?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it underscores also the need for, yesterday, we had a session on the need for effective community engagement, which is really meaningful and engages all the community stakeholders, and the role that community representatives could play, for example, in trying and ensure that the consent process is really meaningful and participants are able to understand some of the difficult concepts involved in research. So in the context of a biobanking, I also think that community representatives, for example, could have a role to play in ensuring that researchers do not just include technical languages or jargon in their informed consent processes, the informed consent forms, but really try to translate all those complex and technical terms into understandable and simple language, which most of the participants who are illiterate most times could also understand and be able to then meaningfully provide consent based on information that they've understood, that is really simple for them to digest, and not just give them loads of jargon and information that is difficult for them to comprehend. So I think there's a key role for community representatives to play in that regard. So it could, for example, include community advisory boards. That's one strategy that I could just think on top of my head. They could be consulted in probably assessing the understandability of the consent language, for example. So to make sure that even other participants in the recruited populations will be able to understand the language that is translated. Yeah.
Thanks. And Leah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. As a Brazilian, I'm used to how we conduct tests back in Brazil, and I've learning that it's quite different in other countries, and sometimes I'm just surprised with how different things are. So my understanding for the consents, so the written consents are always in an accessible language. We never use jargons, and the person who is giving the consent must be able to understand the research. And usually it's the researcher or the principal investigator who is applying that, or a trained person. And so I think this would be ideal. So my personal opinion and how I'm used to conduct research using human samples, it's always like that. You have an integration from the principal investigator, the person who is collecting the sample, and the team who is actually doing the investigation or the analysis. So we have meetings, and then everybody is on the same page, everybody understands, and that's how you can provide, explain the context and the consent to the participant. And I was reading some questions as well, and then about this consent, there are people asking about how to withdraw the consent. So this has to be clear to the participant as well, that the participant can withdraw the research at all times, at any time, and it has to be in the term, it has to be written, and the person has to understand that if tomorrow they just decide that they don't want to participate anymore, they will just contact a person, and then you give them, a telephone number, a contact address, and this person can withdraw. And then the team must have a way to find that sample and discard that. This cannot be used because the participant said that it doesn't want to participate anymore. So I thought that it was like that everywhere, but I'm learning that each country has a different way to understand, a different way to deal. As in this incredible presentation that we had today, I can understand that the governance, it's not clear, as the concepts for ethics and the concepts for biobank are not clear worldwide. So I think there is a lot of room to clarify all those concepts, all those issues. And once we understand those gaps, then we can build capacity. That's what I'm interested in, build capacity. So if I know what are the needs, then I can help our partners to achieve that.
Thank you so much, Leah. Now, I'm going to, I hope Aminu has caught his breath back, because on the consent issue, I'm going to go back to his presentation where he said it's important to find a middle ground in consent models. And this is, and he brought this in for the greater good. And I think that's a really, really important statement that Aminu made. I'm going to put it to the panel. Leah, you excluded because you're from Brazil, but I'm going to put it to our African members of the panel that perhaps we have relied too much on the Western paradigm in terms of our approach to this issue. And maybe we should go back to looking at our African indigenous values and principles of Ubuntu or Umuntu, whatever we want to call it, where the community is central, and the principles and values of interdependence and interrelatedness is actually critical. And if we approach it from this perspective, then would consent be such an issue? Why does consent, the issue of consent from the Western world, have to be imported? And why do we have to colonialize consent here? Who wants to take that first, Aminu or Blessing?
I'll let Blessing take it.
Okay, Blessing, go for it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting and complex topic. But I certainly agree that at some point we do need to have a sort of an Afrocentric way or paradigm of doing consent. So it needs not exactly be the same model that is used in other developing countries, because as you rightly said, we have different cultures, we have different values, we have different philosophies. For example, you mentioned Ubuntu, and I just wanted to bring in the issue of there is an emerging concept of solidarity, and I think it's a principle which is really, well grounded in our African culture, and so from that principle, I think sometimes people would really, give their samples because of that altruistic nature. They want to donate samples for the greater good of humanity, to advance scientific progress. So, and therefore, that can also mean that sometimes we don't have to stick to restrictive consent models that that would, sort of hinder progress of research, because participants have really, because based on that, principle of Ubuntu or solidarity, they value the importance of research, and they are agreeing to donate their samples so that research can advance science that can in turn also, maybe benefit them or benefit their future generations. So we really need to start thinking also of coming up with consent models that do align with those African principles of Ubuntu, of solidarity, and not just stick to the sort of old way of doing things with consent models that do not support this solidarity principle or the principles of Ubuntu. I don't know if that answers that question, Ames.
Yeah, I think it's important, because when we look at many of these discussions that we have on our African continent, whether it's local or whether it's a Pan-African one like this, and we have our African participants talking about issues like this, consent, ownership, etc. But we're only drawing from Western paradigms. And I think it's really, really, really important. I mean, we talk about our African realities in so far as how all things are unequal and how we are being exploited. But at the same time, we import colonialized consent. Not going the Western paradigm route does not mean there's a lack of respect for persons. That is brought in as well. And in Africa, I think we need to go back to remember our, whatever we do in line with Ubuntu is for the common good. But I'm not going to go into that any further. Aminu, do you have any contribution to this?
Thank you, Ines. So it's interesting now, but I think your last sentence or last two sentences actually say what's on my mind. So it's important to, because what you said is having an African way of doing that does not necessarily mean we are not respecting the participants. So we are going back to basic principles, which is respecting our cultures and our values, and of course, what it is we take as individuals that we need to be respected. So to a greater extent, what I'm beginning to think is, yes, it might be important for us to have, really think through a process that is more African than what we have learned and are adopting into the way we are recruiting research participants, or what we hold to be the right way to consent participants in our research studies. I think at the core of it, though, whichever process we adopt would lead to the same thing, which is that of respect. And so I think that's and even if we go back to how did consent come about, some people argue that arguably the Nuremberg Code is one that really first put forward an exclusive or requirement for consent. And it's really protection. So whatever model we put forward, that it's more in tune with our African values and African cultures, I think it will achieve the same aims as what has been put forward, from the Western perspective, which is that of respect. But I think indeed there has a lot of discussion has been ongoing and on the need to have something that resonates more with the sort of our values and our cultures, than otherwise. So for example, just the last one. Last 2 years, we've started this bioethics forum in Nigeria. This was, I think, the 5th year. We are still on it. One of the key issues that came about, was this discussion about trust, that you need to be able to build trust. But, an interesting dimension I learned from that was, well, a lot of the times this issue of trust is probably not happening, because whereas the African participants, they in most cases agree to participate in research studies, not based on their word for word and in-depth understanding of the consent document that has been read out to them or they have read, but rather based on their trusting of the research participants. And very often what is lacking is actually a reciprocal trust or a reciprocal mandate by those researchers to respect that trusting relationship between the researchers, from the research participants. So rather what is proposed in that meeting is maybe what should be most important is an accountability. So principle of accountability on the side of the researchers would almost always lead to trust, because ab initio, we know that a number of African communities just participate in research because they have seen somebody they've recognized. They have seen some people that they think, oh, these people are here to do good for us, but really not because they have understood the lingo and the legal implications of signing an informed consent.
Thank you.
Could I just add something very quickly?
Sure.
I just thought. So I think from my perspective, what I see sometimes as a missing, piece to this whole puzzle is sometimes that we lack, voices from African participants who are involved in some of these studies. And I think, of course, there are some research groups, particularly in Cape Town, who have tried to, do some empirical studies where they actually try to understand what are participants' preferences, for example, in regard to consent. What type of consent do they prefer? What are their views and experiences of participating in some of these studies, such as biobanks? And I think, so if we could have more of those voices and really trying to capture what are the preferences of people on the ground who are involved in some of these studies, I think that could also help us in sort of formulating appropriate models and governance frameworks that are really informed, so from sort of like a top-down, bottom approach, as opposed to top-bottom approach. So we really need to start, and I'm challenging researchers here, social science researchers and other researchers, qualitative researchers, to really try and invest in trying to understand what are participants' preferences in Africa when it comes to some of these ethical issues around consent and what they want to see being done with their samples and all those pressing ethical issues related to biobanks. I think once we start doing that, once we start having those empirical data from participants, then I think that could go a long way in helping us, start formulating sort of responsive and more appropriate frameworks that align with the values, the preferences of our African participants.
And maybe that discussion should do away with the word consent so that it doesn't ab initio abuse the people's minds by saying, oh, we want to say which model of consent you agree with. But maybe a more terminology, again, going back to Amy's issue of respect, how would the question should be, how would participants feel better respected in getting their agreement to participate in a research study, rather than which model of consent would you rather prefer, whether it's specific or...
Yeah.
Thanks. We'll move on to another topic now, and this is to do with governance. And Amandio has posed an important issue that some of us also see when we review the MTAs and DTAs. So what he says is these documents are so important and they have obligations on all parties to respect governance. But then when it comes to the clause on arbitration, or should there be a dispute, this has to be in a court of law in the Western world, so maybe in the UK or the USA, etc. How is that handled? And the question he asks is there any possibility for us in the LMICs to actually refuse to sign that clause of the DTA or MTA? And I'll go one step further and ask if LMICs should not put pressure on having that clause changed to any dispute resolution, if handled in a court, should be handled in the city, in that country, that LMIC country. What are your thoughts on that? Who should we start with? Maybe Aminu, because you've been handling governance.
Thank you, Emis. So it's interesting actually that the experience of the person asking the question is that the dispute resolution has been, usually traditionally deferred to the developed country, as the case might be. But I think personally an MTA should actually, once you're collecting samples from my country and you're taking it out, I think it's just the fairest thing to do to say, okay, then any disputes has to be resolved based on the rules and regulations or the laws of that particular country. I see for some other countries, for example, where different cities might have different regulations. I'm not sure of that, but there are. So for example, in the United States, we know different states have different regulations. I think there is less of that in LMICs, but there are potentially some LMICs that have those kind of local regulations. But I do believe that any dispute resolution should be based on the rules, laws, and regulations of the LMIC country from where samples have been taken, have been issued. Really, that's what I believe that is fair.
Thanks. And Blessing, do you have anything to contribute to that?
Yeah, look, I think we do not even need to go to reach that stage where we have disputes about samples ownership and stuff. If we have right from the get-go appropriate ethics and governance systems in place that govern how these samples should be used, and these are adhered to, and these are all agreed to prior to even starting collection and building these biobanks, I think we would probably even won't reach all these disputes. And so I think I would suggest that I think all parties really need to ensure that we have all these systems, ethics, and governance processes in place prior to even embarking on these biobanking research projects, so that we do not even reach to that extent where there are disputes. But in the unlikely event that there's been disputes, I know Amini alluded to a situation where a UK-based large institution was accused of stealing DNA samples from African populations. And I think there was sort of mutual engagement between the two parties, so the universities in South Africa and that other institution in the UK, and then I think they agreed to a way forward to, I think, to destroy the samples or to bring back the samples back to Africa. So I think those are some of the things that could be negotiated mutually before even taking each other to courts and stuff. So I really think we need some of those ways of dealing with disputes being entrenched maybe in the standard operating procedures of the institutions, or if it's an IRB or an ethics committee, they have to include in their standard operating procedure that in the event that there is a conflict, this is how we handle it. But in my own opinion, I think we really need to have all those processes, governance and ethics processes in place, so that might help alleviating, or stopping, all these cases from even going to high courts and stuff for dispute resolution.
Thank you.
So while we in the process of putting these processes in place, would you, and I throw this out to all three of you, would you consider it important for the Research Ethics Committee to review the material transfer agreement? Because there's some pushback by the legal people, especially in research offices, when research ethics committees get involved in the MTAs and DTAs. And would you consider it important for the Research Ethics Committee to be a signatory to the MTA or DTA? Leah, let's start with you. What's your experiences in Brazil?
Well, in Brazil, the ethics committees are always volunteer people who work in the institution. So they work to protect the samples and the institution. And so in a collaboration, international collaboration, the ethics committee will always review if the agreements are equal for both sides. And of course, to protect mostly the participants, or when we have animals involved, if we are doing a good use of the animals. So my understanding is that the ethics committee of a particular country or a particular institution should make sure that the agreement is protecting locally rather than the other part. So, and because we know that in the other part we put the agreement in our ethics committee as well, and then they will have their point of view in the other countries. So that's my understanding of the role of the ethics committee. They should make sure that everything and everybody is protected.
And would you suggest they are signatories onto the agreement as well? So in other words, the agreement isn't approved until, well, you'll have the two parties, maybe the institution and the institution outside the country. Would you consider the Research Ethics Committee also putting a signature on this MTA for that additional safeguard, considering the exploitations that we've heard?
Yes, I believe so. They need to be accountable as well on their decision. And I think this back up the protection of the local institution.
Thanks. Blessing?
Yeah, I certainly think RICs have such a central role to play, in data sharing agreements. And I think they need to be capacitated to be able to, to have a say in how, transfer agreements take place. So I certainly think they have to be involved, and they need to be signatories of all those MTAs and DTAs. Otherwise, without their involvement, I think we open up to, some unethical use of data and samples creeping in. So I think RICs have such a critical and important role to play, and they definitely need to be included in this entire process.
Okay, and Aminu? And from the governance perspective, would research ethics committees have that legal authority? I see Professor Mutli has posed this question. Would they have this legal authority to sign off on the MTA?
Yes, so that's an interesting question, whether they have the legal authority to sign. And I think that would depend on the different settings, unless if it is, because to talk about legal authority, then it must have been documented in a given statute that, whether the ethics committee can have that role or not. But just to backtrack a little bit, I think MTA negotiations need to happen. So with a very good research partnership and collaboration, with really involved discussion from the conception of the research study with the local LMIC collaborators. As Blessing said, it may be possible to avoid, disputes that lead to issues about, whether to sign an MTA or not. But about whether the role of ethics committees, I would share what our experience and provisions are in Nigeria. So our national guideline particularly mentions that the responsibility of the human research participant protection system to also protect LMIC or local researchers, so researchers in the country. And in addition to protecting the human research participants. And one of the key instruments that sought to provide that protection is the MTA or the DTA. So in order to uphold or facilitate that protection, what is provided for is that all MTAs have to be approved by the National Research Ethics Committee. So even when research studies are approved within an institution, so each research institution is expected to have its own ethics committee that is registered and accredited by the National Ethics Committee. So, but even when that research study is institution specific and got the ethics approval for that study within that institution, where there is an MTA to be signed, it is expected that MTA will now be shared with the National Ethics Committee for its review and endorsement. So the National Ethics Committee does not sign the MTA, but issues a letter of endorsement to say they have reviewed the MTA and the MTA is acceptable based on their review.
Thanks, thank you. So let's move on to another topic, and Henry Hansen has posted something very interesting. I think it's going to generate some discussion as well. And the question he asks to you is, what do you think about biobanking and the issues in terms of migration of study populations due to war or climate change or for whatever reason, and the sensitivity of data generated from those populations. So you biobank and then you have migrations and the populations are not around. And in addition, some of the data may be very sensitive. So what are your opinions on this? How would one proceed in this situation? Who wants to go first? Amino?
Thank you, Anis. So that's an interesting question. So basically, the way I would like to look at that question is to say that there is no longer a system or a country to fall back to in terms of, samples are from a given country, and due to displacement, there isn't that mechanism to fall back to ask about, ownership, or to refer to what their guidelines are on secondary use of the samples that have already been collected, or secondary use of the data that has already been collected. I'm thinking that's probably another way to put the question, because it's when people are no longer there, then what do you do? How do you still then uphold, their consent provisions and all that? But another issue, of course, is the issue of benefit. How do you then, if there was any benefit to be given back to those populations, how do you give back? But another way to consider that question, of course, is if you are actually conducting a research study on displaced populations, because this is another dimension of it. It's not that you have conducted research and the people have then been displaced, where you then run into a dilemma of then how do you feedback, who do you refer to when you want to use the data for secondary purposes. But if you're then doing research with people that are already displaced. So with these two different scenarios, my thoughts are that in the first instance, where there is no longer a mechanism, either you can give back the results, I think those are important considerations, and I'm not sure that there is a direct answer to this, but this is what I would say. In my understanding is that there is an expectation of, I'm trying to find the right word here. So, so for example, when you look at the GDPR from the EU, one of the things that the GDPR, and in Nigeria too, we have an NDPR published like last year. One of the things that it requires for data protection is any institution that you're sharing data with has to have a commensurate mechanism to protect the data. So you have to provide that assurance that the institutions you're sharing data with have also commensurate mechanisms to protect the data. So if we are to extrapolate that, that the people you have shared data with would have commensurate mechanisms to protect the data, just like as you have in your own country, in a situation where then it also involves samples, you want to expect that there are also commensurate mechanisms to continue to uphold the provisions of an MTA, because you only share samples or store samples in another country biobank where there is an agreement. It doesn't happen outside an agreement. So I think one of the key things is going to rely on is really on the integrity of the collaborating researchers to uphold the terms and conditions of the initial agreements when there is no longer a people or a country or a system to get back to further discuss, how those samples can be used on in secondary terms, so to speak. But where you are now doing a study on IDPs, two issues. In most cases, people that are displaced will be displaced within a certain territory. So they will be refugees within another country's territory. This is just my own understanding of how I think that this could play out. One way of doing it is really a number of instances, people that are in displaced communities also are seen as an obligation of the United Nations system to take care of and provide protection from them, in addition to the country territory in which they are displaced. or in which they are now refugees, so to speak. An instrument like the WHO Ethics Committee, for example, could be a mechanism that can facilitate ethics review of research studies that can be conducted, among displaced populations. While another option is to consider then, because they are within a certain country territory, to defer to the ethics review and human research protection regulations of that particular country mechanism. So I think these are probably two things that could help to ensure that we consistently continue to protect the research participants.
Ames, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, Leah. How would you consider this? Do you have a similar issue in Brazil?
So we have, like, for instance, the native population, and sometimes they migrate from, one place to another. So those populations, they will fall over the vulnerable population. So the ethical regulations on those populations are even tighter. So it's not like impairs the research, but makes it like very restrictive and to protect those populations. So there are other boxes that you have to follow to research on those vulnerable populations. And then that's how it works. But as I was mentioning, so in Brazil, we do have an ethical committee and we have a national committee. So we have all those regulations, all draft, and then we follow that. So it's all covered, and even for human research and non-vulnerable population. So we kind of have a guidance to do that, which makes, I think, easier. But I appreciate that this is hard in other countries. And as I said, so you have to, you must have an understanding of what populations you have in your country, and then you have to adapt to your own reality. So I think that's it. So we do have in place guidelines to deal with that and how to do. Usually we will contact, a leader of that population. So we have this contact, and then we can feedback the population if they are willing to, and things like that. We do have a guideline.
Thanks. We can go on until what we would in South Africa have noon, 12 o'clock, which would probably be 10 on your end. Well, and I think we should. There's one question. I think let's just take the last question, and then wrap up. So Nikwan Gopte says that most of the people who collect data are never considered as part of the research team and are never mentioned in the publication. And Aminu did allude to some of this. How can we improve the state of affairs, and he makes a statement: collaboration in Africa has been reduced to data collection. And just to go further, in terms of Aminu's presentation earlier, would it be that biobanks are just glorified freezers in Africa? Freezers to export specimens to the richer countries? Blessing, we'll start off with you, and then we'll move on to Aminu.
Yeah, I think, as Aminu already alluded to in his earlier presentation, we do need in our frameworks to also ensure that we deal with this issue of fair collaboration and fair benefit sharing. So in the context of data collectors being used just for the purposes of data, I think that some of those problems could be safeguarded, for example, by ensuring that these are included in, say, publications that emanate from doing such research. They are acknowledged for their, important role that they play. They're not just there to be data collectors of samples that will then be parachuted outside of Africa to, developed countries where there are more resources to be able to do data analysis and genomic analysis. So I really think the issue of fair benefit sharing and fair and meaningful collaboration does address this question, to say we need to ensure that African scientists and researchers are not just used as mere data collectors, but they're actually acknowledged, and they do get authorship, for example, when they meaningfully contributed to collection and analysis of this sample. All that needs to be agreed upon and addressed in the governance systems. Yeah.
Thanks. And before, before you come in, it's what should the solution be? Researchers and ethicists and everyone outside the policymakers are faced with problems because our governance systems are actually not facilitatory, and they're not protective enough. So there's huge fault lines in our governance systems. When you, as you respond to the question that was posed, how do we actually then take it forward in terms of our governance systems? What do we do to ensure that our policymakers assist us and stop our populations from being exploited or safeguard against that? Aminu, over to you.
Thank you, Emis. Okay, so another dimension to that initial question is really two things. So with African research collaborators being considered as mere data collectors, I think the issue of fairness in research collaboration will be able to address that. However, consider another scenario. You're doing, let's say, a national survey of tuberculosis in a country of, say, 120 million or 180 million or 200 million people. And you have recruited, tens of thousands of people that are going out there to the communities to collect data and collect samples, I think that's quite a really different scenario. And I think in that scenario, I do see the difficulty of including each and every one of those tens of thousands of people that were employed and paid with an agreement that they're just facilitating data collection to now involve them as co-authors. But I think it becomes a pertinent issue where somebody in the research protocol has been listed to play a specific role, and then those people are not being given the opportunity to contribute to a publication. So I think that it is only in that instance that we can begin to talk about authorship. So, and this is again for clarity, instances where people are mentioned as part of the research protocol that was approved by the Research Ethics Committee, and then those people are not supported or empowered to contribute to publications that are coming out from that particular research. So this is what happens. There is, as we know, guideline for co-authorship that has been issued out by, a group of the journals, isn't it? I can't remember exactly the name of that.
ICJME, yeah.
ICJME, exactly. And so there are about 3 or 4 or 5 requirements, and it is only when you fulfill those requirements that you can become an author. So becoming an author really required significant contribution, not just to the study design, not just to the data collection, not just to the data analysis, but actually intellectual contribution to tease out and make meaning out of that data to be able to write a publication that says this is what it means is critical. However, what then happens in a number of instances is only the people that already have that capacity, that are leading the research study, that will just go ahead and just, write up publications, ignoring other people that were already on the protocol. I think what is fair is that everyone else that is listed on the research protocol that is approved by the Research Ethics Committee, even if they have never published before, should be given the opportunity, and where there is need, supported, empowered to be able to make meaningful contributions that would enable them to be listed as co-authors. I think that's really critical. But I've mentioned the challenge of course, involving tens of thousands of people that have facilitated, whom you have paid off as data collectors to include them as co-authors. But one thing that could be done, again, is depending on the level of contribution, because even in that gamut of people that have been involved, there are some people that have really helped to ensure the coordination and the bringing together of the data. You could list some of those under acknowledgement. And I think there's always room to include some other people that have played ancillary roles in the research study, to acknowledge them, under the section on acknowledgements. Of course, the room for that depends on from journal.
I think we've lost you, Aminu, but we've also gone beyond time now. So thank you so much for your contributions. And on that note, I think I'm going to draw from what Professor Godfrey Tangwa said yesterday. There's so many questions and they continue blowing in the wind. And so even with biobanks, the questions are still blowing in the wind. I want to thank our presenters, our panelists, and our audience. Thank you. We've had a very interactive audience with lots of questions. Appreciate you making this such a successful session. I'm going to hand over to Max for housekeeping before we hop off for tea. Max, over to you.
Ames, thank you very much. Wonderful sharing. Thank you so much. And Aminu, brilliant talk, lots of discussion. And thanks so much, Blessing and Leah. That was a really fascinating discussion. I think with all of these, we could carry on, couldn't we? Thanks very much, everyone. So we're now going to have a 15-minute break, and we'll come back promptly to start our final session on ethics review in epidemics. So enjoy your break. We'll see you all in 15 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a good break. So we're now going to go into our fourth and final session of the workshop, ethics review in epidemics. We've got 3 presentations and then a discussion. And I'm just going to ask Blessing. Blessing, could you please introduce our chair for this next session, please? Thank you. Hello, Blessing. Okay, we seem to have lost Blessing. So I'm going to introduce our chair, if that's okay. And our chair is Professor, is it Hani? Do I pronounce it? Hani?
Yes,
You're
Hani
very
Sleen.
welcome. It's Professor Hani Sleen, and Hani is the head of the dermatology department in the National Hepatology and Tropical Medicine Research Institute in Cairo. And Hani is the coordinator of the Egyptian Network of Research Ethics Committees, and he's participated in the establishment of several RECs in Egyptian research institutions. So he's very, very well placed to chair and lead us through this session. So Hani, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Meg. Thank you, everybody, for attending today in our last session in this great online workshop. It's my pleasure to participate in this session as a chairperson. We will discuss implication of ethics review and REC operation due to COVID-19 epidemics. We We don't only want to offer advice, but we also want to learn and hear from others about what they are going through during this time. The epidemic affects all aspects of life, and ESIC committee is no exception. What are lessons learned? What do we need to improve or develop? We will exchange experience from different African countries, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, that will reach the experience for all of us. We will begin. We have a very eminent speaker today with us. We will begin with Dr. Caroline Cassini. Dr. Caroline Cassini is a Fogarty African Bioethics Training Program alumni and serve as a training coordinator of the Scientific and Ethics Review Unit, Kenya Medical Research Institute. She will talk about the ethics review in a pandemic, a case of Kenya Medical Research Institute Scientific and Ethics Review Unit. You are welcome, Dr. Caroline. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Slim, for that introduction. Can I be made the co-host, please? I would like to use my own slides, if it's possible. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I want to take you through our experience at the Kenya Medical Research Institute, Scientific and Ethics Review Unit, CERU, our experience of ethics review in this COVID-19 pandemic. So the Kenya Medical Research Institute, CERU was inaugurated in 2014. However, the Kenya Medical Research Institute came into being in 1979 by an act of parliament. We have 12 centers, and the picture on the right is a picture of the Center for Geographic Medicine Research Coast in Kilifi, a picture of it later in the evening when the lights look so beautiful. And this is where the COVID-19, one of the Oxford COVID-19 vaccine trial is taking place. So what has happened since March the 13th, when the first case of COVID-19 was reported in Kenya? About 9 days later, we decided to suspend the receipt of hard copies of requests for continuing review and COVID-19 related applications, because at the time there was word that the COVID-19 virus was lasting long on paper and plastic. So after that, on that very same day, we had our first virtual meeting using Zoom software, domiciled in a boardroom with a wide screen TV. So the rest of Committee B members were in their homes or their offices. And as the Secretariat, we sat in this boardroom with our masks on, and we had the meeting from there. On the 27th of March, Director Kemri gave us a directive that anyone who could work from home should work from home. And the Secretariat of the Scientific and Ethics Review Unit, many of us opted to work from home. And actually, I have worked from home ever since that time. On 30th March, we suspended the receipt of all other applications in hard copy. And you are only able to submit your proposal to our Secretariat through the Kemri email. In April, Kemri secured the Microsoft Teams as the institute-wide software for documents management and e-meetings. And on the first Tuesday of April, when we normally have our Committee A meeting, we were the first unit in Kemri to utilize the platform in this Committee A meeting. And actually, we are also the first unit to share our documents using a private channel that is only accessible to the Secretariat staff. So you can see in about under 6 weeks, we were able to change completely from manual, what we were before, into an online system. And this is something we've been trying to do for ages, but because of COVID-19, that priority came on top of the list. And we are actually quite grateful for COVID for that reason. Well, so I'd like to take you through the last 9 months at CERU, the Scientific and Ethics Review Unit. The predecessor was the Kemri ERC, but we decided to join Scientific Review and Ethics Review in one unit and in one committee. So CERU, Scientific and Ethics Review Unit, was inaugurated, as I said, in 2014. And we have actually 3 committees that run in this unit. So the first thing we did was, first thing I wanted to show you were the quick turnaround requests. And what are these? So we have expedited review, and we also have quick turnaround requests. And we have quick turnaround requests just because of situations such like this, outbreaks, pandemics, epidemics. And it's something we had put into our SOPs before just to deal with such situations, not knowing that we were going to have a pandemic. So you can see a quick turnaround also means about between 3 and maybe 9 people can review the study. It's more than minimal risk, so it's not like expedited, which would be not more than minimal risk. And any number from 3 to 9 reviewers can review it. So for example, the COVID-19 one for the vaccine trial, we were like 10 reviewers on that one. And the idea is that you need to review within 3 days. And the whole process should take 10 days maximum, including the response from the PI. So it really is a quick turnaround. This really burdened our committee members because other things went on as usual. So we'd had to do the quick turnaround on top. And by the end of these 9 months, we've actually had 50 requests for quick turnaround. So you can see in April, the yellow bars are the total. Committee A, Committee A is blue, Committee B is orange, Committee C is gray, and the yellow is total. In April, we began getting requests for quick turnaround. And by June, that was the maximum number we had in 1 month, 19 requests for quick turnaround. And then from June, it has been going up and down. It came down until September, then went up a bit in October. And that's where we are in November. So that put a burden on the already quite burdened ethics committee, but it had to be done. Another thing that changed over the last 9 months are the notifications related to COVID-19 restrictions. And again, as you can see, March is when our first case was mentioned. And then I want to add that in April, the Director Kemri also said that all field activities were suspended. It's because, again, our government decided that there would be no inter-county movement. And so you could not go from one county to another. And this really did affect our field activities. So for the next 3 months, there was a freeze of field activities. And hence, you can see in April, again, the total is what is in yellow. That's when we had our highest number of notifications. And many of them were to suspend activities because of the COVID-19 restrictions. But you can see by July and August, the number of restrictions are coming down lower because the inter-county restrictions were only for 3 months. Then in July, it was lifted and we could go inter-county. So you can see the number of notifications went down. This is a screenshot of an agenda review of study notifications. We have our agenda has a section for this. And I just wanted to show you that non-Kemri 545, the very first one you can see in the agenda, is suspension of field activities. And then if you look at minute 48, 3605, resumption of activities after a study suspension due to COVID-19. So I was just showing you this because we noticed that come May, June, we were getting notifications asking for resumptions and for remote monitoring. So you can see the total number of notifications are in blue. The green are the study resumptions, the notifications that we're talking about, study resumptions. And you can see they slowly go up from May, June, all the way to November, because now the studies were able to figure out how to continue working despite the COVID-19 restrictions, and they were able to start again. The next few slides are just to show you how we actually did it practically, but these are just screenshots. And this one is just showing you a screenshot of kemriseru18@gmail.com, where we were receiving, and these are an example of a secretariat person sending various applications. So the first one was 4110, where there were addressed comments. Next was new protocol. Next one was CERU 3917, a serious adverse event. And finally, we have the Center for Geographic Medicine Research, Center Scientific Committee, sending us a notification 3605. So we had someone on the communication desk, and their job was to receive these emails and look for completeness. They had to pre-review them for completeness. So the documents would come in usually in a zipped folder. It would have to be opened and each document would have to be checked according to our checklist. So this was the work of the person on the communication desk. At the same time, we would still write it out in our book because, you know, internet is as it is. If something went and we had no electricity or whatnot, we'd have another record of what had come in. And then after this, an agenda would be made. So this is a screenshot. You can see at the arrow, that's the agenda for a particular meeting. And then there are various things in the agenda. There are closures, requests for continuing review, notifications, initial documents, and so on. Expedited initial or the quick turnaround ones would be part of the agenda, but they would have been already reviewed, so they would just be coming in for ratification. So this is what it would look like, and then the packets would be made online, e-packets that would be sent to us as reviewers. I'm a reviewer, I'm in the Secretariat, and I'm also a reviewer. And then you'd open your packet and you'd go ahead and read it, send your comments back. So what have been the challenges experienced by the Secretariat in this last few months? Well, the biggest one, I guess it is for everyone, intermittent internet access. So the government did give us, as Secretariat members who are working from home, bundles so that we could use internet, but there was an outcry from the members saying they would also like bundles because sometimes things go, they don't have electricity or something has gone wrong. And this has been one of our biggest challenges. In meetings, people drop off, but fortunately they have sent their comments before and we can go through the comments even if they're not in the meeting. Members took time to understand how MS Teams operates, especially sharing of documents. I was one of those members and I struggled quite a lot with this, and there was a lot of back and forth with the Secretariat until I got it. And I was now able to find the documents on the MS Teams. Email submission was also not sustainable and still is not sustainable, but I'm happy to report that we shall probably be adopting Rhino shortly so that this should help us with the volume of the documents that come. So sometimes they would bounce back and we wouldn't know that it had bounced back because of issues of volume or things like that. Sometimes reviewers got their packets and the packets had nothing. The folders were empty and they'd have to, again, talk to the Secretariat and say, please assist us on that. One of the things we did this month was sit down with the chairs of the committees to discuss some of the challenges we faced or their experiences during the last year, because it does look like we're going to be doing this again in 2021. And we wanted to just share and find out what we were doing right and what we had experienced. And the first thing, one of the things they said is that the quality of the deliberations has reduced. Members tend to shy away from discussing protocols that they did not review. And this again is just because of sometimes, you know, internet connectivity and not being able, it just takes a longer time. So people decided just to be quiet. However, presentations were clearer and to the point, and that was a good thing. Sometimes reviewers were in a noisy place, sometimes in their car, sometimes just in a place where there's a lot of background noise, and that would affect the meetings, although the IT savviness has definitely improved over time. It saves time, but we all agreed that we missed the body language. We do our verdicts not by hands up, but by consensus. And when you're in a room with someone and they are quiet, you can look at their face and determine whether they really have a problem with it or not, even if they're just quiet. But over the Zoom, it might be a bit difficult over MS Teams. So we do miss the body language. And we also noticed that the enthusiasm and energy has gone low, and it could be that members are just zoomed out. There are so many meetings that take place over the internet, it can be tiring. But the greatest news from this COVID-19 pandemic in our Ethics Review Committee Secretariat is that our quorum has been excellent all through the year. And this is something that we have really been happy about. So changes as a result of the COVID-19. One last change I wanted to share with you is that we had to come up with some guidelines. And if you go to our our homepage, you can see Home About, and under Research, you'll get the Scientific and Ethics Review Unit. And then under that, you'll see the KEMRI-SERU COVID-19 guidelines. Now, at the yesterday, Prof. Kimanthi was talking about informed consent and how there was a lot of copy and pasting during the COVID period, and perhaps people were not taking into consideration some very practical things on the ground that would negate all the guidelines that we are putting through. But we did try and write some guidelines and put them on our webpage to help guide our scientists and the members of the committee as they reviewed the proposals and as the scientists as they tried to implement the proposals. So I just took one section from our guidelines, and this really is my last slide, talking about documenting of the consent. And this is what we said: place the following materials in the research study source documentation, and it could be an e-copy, it could be printed and put as a paper, a copy of the full informed consent document signed by the study team and witness. And before then, we had talked about the various ways you can sign: by telephone, oral, verbal signing, by electronic software if you had it. There's a lot of talk of that before this. A copy of the full informed consent and the study team and witness attestation form signed electronically. And finally, this is the bit I thought was a bit different from what would be normal. This is 4.9.6.3. A notation by the investigator of how the consent was obtained, e.g. was it by telephone, did they use a software, how it was confirmed, that the patient signed the consent form either by attestation, again, you have to have a notation, an attestation of the witness and investigator, or the photograph of the signed consent. The note should include a statement of why the informed consent document signed by the patient was not retained, e.g. due to contamination of the document by infectious material or something of that sort. So this notation is something new that we have introduced because we know that it needs to be described. In as much as we've given our guidelines, maybe they're not practical. So whichever way they are tempted to do this, they need to describe it so that in future, when anybody looks back at it, they would be satisfied that effort was made for a proper consent process. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think I'll stop here. There's a lot more I could have said, but this is enough just to show you a snapshot of what has been happening in the last 9 months. And we are grateful actually that all of us in Seru are well, and our families too. And we give thanks for that. And at the same time, we are happy that we were able to serve our research participants and our PIs during this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for that great talk. So we'll hand back over to Hani. I think we're going to go straight on to our next speaker, and then we're going to have Q&A at the end. So Hani.
Mags, it's Helena. I'm just trying to get Dr. Hani back, as it seems his microphone doesn't seem connected, at least from what I can see.
Perhaps then, in the interest of time, we could go straight on to the next presentation, if that's okay. And I'm just trying to find the right bit of paper here, excuse me. So our next speaker is Mwifadi Mrisho. Apologies if that's terrible pronunciation.
It's correct.
Thank you. And Mrisho, he is an alumni of the South African Research Ethics Training Initiative, and he's currently the IRB Secretary of the Ifakara Health Institute in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And his talk is going to be on ethical implementation of research during epidemics. And this is a Tanzania perspective, as Hani said. Oh, hi, Hani.
Hello, hi, Hani.
Sorry, we lost you. So I'm just So we're going to now have, as Hani said, now we're going to have, we've had Kenya, now we're going to have Tanzania, and then finally we'll have South Africa. So over to you, Mrisho. Thank you.
Thank you, Mags. My name is Mwifadi Mrisho. As Mags said, I'm working with the Ifakara Health Institute. I will present on ethical implementations of research during epidemics, Tanzania perspectives. My outline of the presentation, as you can see, I will talk a little bit about IHI, IRB, and then steps taken by the government during and after the pandemic, development of guidelines, and what next after COVID. Condition that focused on addressing the risk of COVID-19, and I will also talk about the other issue related to the addressing of COVID-19. IHI-IRB, or Ifakara Health Institute Review Board, was established in 2005 with the 9 members. But as we speak now, it has 15 members with the different diversities. And the main role of the IHI-IRB is to ensure that human subjects participated in health research implemented under the umbrella of IHI or Ifakara Health Institute are protected as per national and international health research guidelines. So as you can see, this is diversity of our institution review board members. So as I said earlier, the main activities are to provide the independent, competent, and the timely review of ethics of research proposals submitted in our institution, and also to monitor the research that are implemented on the ground. So I will talk briefly on how the government reacted upon the addressing COVID-19 pandemic. So the National Health Research Ethics Committee, that's a NATREC, developed the kind of a guideline to guide the researchers in Tanzania during COVID-19. These guidelines were endorsed by the chairman of the Medical Research Counseling Committees, MRCC, of the National Institute for Medical Research, who is, the overall in charge of the health research in Tanzania, and the chief medical officers. In line with the directives provided by the Tanzania government, the main issue were to protect the research participants and researchers, as well as healthcare providers, from contracting COVID-19. So as you can see, the timing for the COVID was on the March and April. So by 9th of April 2020, the government, through the National Institute for Medical Research, NATRE committee, implemented the guidelines, and this was said to be implemented until further notice. However, it took 40 days to lift the restrictions announced. So principal investigators and researchers were asked to pause seeing participants, especially for the following studies: observational studies, non-interventional studies, and the non-therapeutic studies. During this time, the principal investigators were required to notify NATREC about the changes, about the enrollment, the ongoing procedures on the ground, and the changes made to their protocols. And it also suspended all high-risk activities that were limited to training, interviews, focus group discussions, and household interviews for the above-mentioned studies. Clinical trial and the therapeutic researches were allowed to continue, but with the following conditions. First conditions was related to stopping recruiting the participants, and there should be no additional studies to accrue, or follow-ups of participants should take place through telephone. Exceptional reasons were, of course, were supposed to be discussed with the NATREC, that's the committee, national committees. Also, there were if canceling or postponing of the activities could increase the risk, then this allowed the experimental studies to proceed. Or if canceling or postponing of the activities will deprive the benefit of the participants, then that kind of studies were allowed to continue. And also if research holds potential benefits, direct benefit to the research participants, such as ongoing studies on investigational products, then these were allowed to continue. And also, if the studies involved the collection of the safety data to detect the serious adverse events, then they were also supposed to proceed. Likewise, the PIs were asked to ensure that there was safe ongoing monitoring of the severe adverse events. And also some of the recommendations resulted, of course, in delayed visit or protocol deviation. These were supposed to be reported to the National Committee. In addition to that, all principal investigators or researchers were requested to advocate the directives on preventing transmission of the COVID-19 in order to protect research participants, healthcare workers, and the field staff. Among of the recommended preventive measures were to practice hygiene, washing of hands with water and soap frequently, the use of sanitizers, avoiding touching face, nose, or eyes. Also maintaining social distancing and avoiding unnecessary traveling and gathering. So what happened after 40 days of the pandemic? Then on May 18, the committee, National Medical Research Coordinating Committee lifted these suspensions on the implementations of research activities. And they, of course, allowed the implementation of the protocol as were approved. So, however, the following conditions or guidelines were put into implementation. The same condition as I mentioned earlier were insisted, such as preventive measures such as wearing face mask, use of sanitizer, hand washings, social distancing, and were still insisted to be practiced during the implementations of research. Also, projects which involved surveys and community engagement, they should, of course, implement their activities, taking into considerations of education materials on preventive measures of COVID-19, such as flyers, leaflets, etc., and to enhance the community knowledge on the pandemic. Research projects also were required to promote all governmental measures, as I mentioned earlier, towards interrupting transmissions of the COVID-19. Likewise, all training activities were supposed to be broken into small groups. Like, for example, if you have a training which involved a number of people, then you were supposed to break the groups into small, so that to avoid the contaminations of the COVID-19. Also, all suspected cases were required to be reported to the different channels. What are the other issues related to the addressing of the COVID-19? Actually, the use of Zoom conference, for example, in the reviewing of the protocols were put into place. And actually this maximized the attendance of the IRB members. We'll find that most of the IRB members will join into these meetings. Also, these meetings through Zoom helped to reduce the associated costs which could associate with the physical meetings. And with regards to the experience on the ground, of course, each and every project were supposed to have any additional budgets to purchase PPE materials such as sanitizers, face masks, and gloves. In addition to that, some of the projects, or most of the projects, due to the restriction which was put into place, resulted into some budget implications because they were still paying the personnel who were in the research activities. So for this case, some of the research activities actually reduced some of the, budgets which were aimed to implement the research, because if they had no, let's say, contingents to purchase those materials, then it means they were more affected. I think this is the end of my presentations. I would like to acknowledge the National Institute for Medical Research, because I borrowed most of the materials from their guidelines, which were implemented as from 9th of April to 18th May. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mufidi, for your great presentation and stick to the time. We are now in our last presentation. Professor Clement Benny from the University of Witwatersrand, Faculty of Health Science. He's a senior scientist and head of Oncology Research Lab, co-chair of Human Ethics Research Committee, and co-chair of Biobank Ethics Committee, member of Genetically Modified Organism Committee. He will give us a talk about the ethics requirement for the COVID-19 pandemics. The floor is yours, Professor Clement.
Thanks very much for the invitation, especially to Blessing. It is a talk that I've given previously before, which Blessing heard. It's about ethics requirements that we followed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we all know, the pandemic upset ordinary moral assumptions with restrictions on freedom of movement and association. And I think certainly most of us have accepted this widely as being necessary. And the pandemic presented us with a moral urgency to conduct rigorous research to rapidly produce evidence about the safety and efficacy of interventions to either treat or prevent COVID-19. And many of these interventions, however, that have not proven safe and efficacious for COVID-19 have been offered outside of research contexts. And as you all know, these interventions have ranged from those that have proven safe and efficacious for a condition other than COVID, and were thus authorized for those conditions. And for example, the now kind of famous or infamous hydroxychloroquine, which was, as you all know, discontinued by the WHO in trials due to safety concerns. And of course, there were interventions that have not been proven effective nor authorized for another condition. And a good example here is remdesivir. And we do have precedents for interventions that were not authorized. If you think back to the treatment of AIDS back in the 1980s, when AZT showed promising results, the patients actually demanded that the drug be made available without going through animal testing. Now, of course, since the safety and efficacy of these interventions have not or were not proven for COVID-19, their risk-benefit profile is or was unknown. But due to the exceptional circumstance of the pandemic, these treatments were offered as an attempt to advance access to intervention so that patients may benefit from these treatments. Now, the WHO advised that unproven intervention should be offered within research protocols, particularly within randomized controlled trials, which are capable of assessing safety and efficacy. Now, in terms of study justification, of course, I've alluded to this is considered in exceptional circumstances as being characterized by the high mortality rates that we've seen and the absence of proven therapeutic options to offer patients available and reasonable opportunities to improve their health condition. As previous speakers have mentioned, rigorous scientific assessment of the available evidence must be conducted by an appropriately qualified scientific and or ethics committee. We do both here on our ethics committee. We don't have a separate scientific committee. And of course, this committee must determine if the proposed intervention has a favorable risk-benefit profile. Now, with regards to ethical and regulatory oversights, the review and approval of an ethics committee are, of course, required together with approval from the relevant national regulatory authorities. And in South Africa, this is the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, who approve all clinical trials related research in South Africa. Now, what we did in South Africa was all of the national ethics committee chairs met online, and we formed an alliance to rapidly review COVID clinical trials of national importance. And this group was called the Research Ethics Support in COVID Pandemic, or RESCOP, as coined by Professor Ames Dye. We also undertook to recognize ethics review by our national counterparts. So where a study had been reviewed or approved in another province, we would recognize that review so as not to duplicate work for our committees. So this is the concept of reciprocity. Our committee, a small group of people, such as described previously by other speakers, reviewed about in the region of 30 COVID research trials in 3 weeks, and the number of trials are now approaching 60, which we've reviewed. We've been quite strict with researchers. We've ensured that all ethics requirements were still met by our researchers. So there still needed to be an information sheet. There needed to be informed consent either by the participant or next of kin, or if either of these, neither of these were available, then by an independent physician, or possibly delayed consent. I haven't mentioned remote consenting here, but we did provide for that. We, of course, also expected all site permissions to be made or provided to the committee so that the research could commence. And this would have included gatekeeper permissions and national laboratory site permissions. And as mentioned, this rapid review process placed additional pressures on our committee members. With regards to the consenting process, the potential participants must be informed clearly that the intervention being offered is not a proven intervention. So it might not actually benefit them and may even harm them. So again, here is the risk versus benefit consideration. And of course, the participants or the potential participants should voluntarily decide based on their understanding and their own assessment of the risks and benefits if they actually want to receive the intervention. Also of key importance is community engagement for the informed consent process. And we had a few incidents in South Africa involving communities which were not adequately engaged, such as a group of health workers, health workers were not consulted as a community or as a group with regards to a vaccine trial. And we also had a situation recently where a resident of a shelter was shunned by shelter mates because they didn't understand what he was participating in, what the study was about, and they thought it was dangerous to be around this person. So that involved engaging and talking to the shelter inhabitants and explaining to them all about the COVID study. Of course, with regards to outcomes, I've alluded to this. We want to see minimal risk. We want to see that benefits outweigh the risks. We want to see wide sharing of scientific data. We encourage this because this information collected may provide information on the intervention's safety and efficacy. And we would like, of course, to see the provision of intervention to communities should these treatments prove successful. My final slide, this is provided or from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. And I think it summarizes more or less what I've discussed today. We want to help reduce suffering. We want to ensure fairness, and we want to ensure equal respect. So on that note, thank you for listening to me. Remember to wear your masks. And I'd just like to acknowledge the willing participants in the many studies and trials. Of course, our HRA committee members and the administrative staff who've played a really important role. I think these people are often overlooked, and our research office who've provided support to the ethics committee. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Professor Clement. A very excellent presentation.
Thank you.
We don't have a question until now.
Hi everyone, it's just Mags here. Just a reminder to post questions into the Q&A if you've got any questions on that session. We'll start some panel discussion, and then we can have some Q&A, and then we were going to have some overall discussion to round off the day. So if you've got any particular questions from those presentations, then either put your hand up and we can actually have you online to speak, or if you can post them in the Q&A chat, that would be great. I wonder if I can be cheeky and start off with a question then, because I'm actually a clinical trialist, and getting ethical approvals for clinical trials has in the past taken a very, very long time, and we actually try to work this in when we're putting in for funding to try and say we want to wait until we've got approval. So does the panel think that following with COVID-19 that we've had much more expedited approvals? Caroline, you were talking about you've been hoping to go online with these things for a long time. Do you think now, and of course we've seen very rapid approval for the COVID vaccines, do you think this is the way in future that we'll be able to have speedier approvals so that we can actually have more expedited research across the board? We've got questions from Efua and Hassan, so perhaps we could start with Efua. Efua Usuf, would you like to ask your question, Efua, please?
Thank you very much. So I'm Efua Yusuf from the Gambia.
Can do this?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So yes, Efua Yusuf from the Gambia. My question, sorry, the names I don't get, but from that was Kenya, talking about, which is what most of us did we already, I'm working with the Medical Research Council here in the Gambia. We already, for our ethical submissions, we're already doing everything electronically. But you mentioned that within a short space of time, you were able to go digital, which was very good. But with regards to the informed consent documents, it seems like what you're saying is that you were still going for signed sheet printed hard copies. So I don't know, do you think there's a possibility of going electronic with that as well? We're planning a clinical trial, and what we want to do is to take scanned copies of those documents and make sure that those will be filed properly in the ETMF. So I don't know what your experience was filing that and what the risk would be of continuing with hard copies, especially for studies that you will have to go out into the community. Thank you.
Okay, may I respond, Max?
Yes, go ahead, Caroline.
Okay,
thank you.
yes, so this is Caroline from Kenya. The section I showed you of our guidelines came at the end of several other sections where we were actually asking people to go completely electronic and to have electronic signatures. But we did realize, and that is the reason we added that bit, that it's sometimes not possible. People don't have, even to take a photograph of a consent document might be difficult, just what Prof. Kimanthi Mudli was saying yesterday. So we added that last section. If you had a software and that didn't work, or the person on the other side, the research participant, didn't have either bundles or a phone that could do things using Wi-Fi or bundles, then we would allow you to have, let's say, verbal consent. So you have a three-way and each person has a telephone and you're doing it over the telephone and there's a witness to attest to what is happening, but there needs to be a note after that to explain why that happened and how that happened. But if it's possible to have electronic signatures, to use electronic software that would allow the patient or the participant to sign without the hard copy, that would be fine. Now, once it was signed electronically, we felt that even if we had an e-copy of that informed consent document, we still felt that it would be nice if it would be printed at the office of the Secretariat and filed as a physical one, just because of issues to do with sometimes electronic things go wrong. So we only wanted that as a backup. So essentially, we are not going backwards from where we are now as CERU. We are going to keep pushing for a lot more electronic. It will be phased, of course. Not everybody has the same resources, but at the same time, we do recognize that not everybody's at the same level, and we still want to get our consent. So if we insist it all has to be electronic, we might get stuck. Is that helpful?
Sure. Thank you very much. These are definitely practical things that we would all face. And like you said, not everybody is at the same level. We struggled with, we were deciding, do we really want to keep hard copies as well as the electronic copies? But I think we have a kind of robust system and we have agreed that we are confident that we will be able to keep electronic copies. But one thing that has been highlighted is the need for QC. So the monitoring would have to be extra, vigilant, so that we're able to do this in real time. Thank you very much.
Hello, for the case of Tanzania, actually, I don't have much to say because much of this research related to COVID-19 were centralized at the national health committees at the central level. So for the Ifakara Health Institute Review Board, we hardly reviewed some of this kind of protocol. Thank you.
Yeah, so from our perspective here, where there was telephonic consenting, these were recorded and also witnessed at the same time. With regards to ICU situations, so where people were very sick and obviously couldn't consent, there was a responsible physician who consented on their behalf. So we still obtained a form of written consent in those cases. But I agree, not everyone is up to speed with electronic consenting. I agree with Caroline.
Thank you very much, panel, for answering that question from Efua. Thank you so much for your question, Efua. I wonder if I could read out a couple of questions for the panel and for Prof. Hani. So the first one is from Julius Imoyera, and the question is, what is the view of the IRB and Research Ethics Committee on the waiver consent used during the COVID-19 pandemic as regards those who could not give consent? And Julius is asking the panel, is this going to be reviewed and adopted? Thank you, panel.
Okay, I think let me go first. Part of our guidelines, we did talk about patients who are unable to consent because of emergency situations. And we have a section where we say that we'll grant waiver of consent in these circumstances. So if the patient is unable to speak because it's an emergency situation and things need to be done, we would agree for waiver of consent. But of course, the proposal has to be very clear under the circumstances in which this is going to take place. So we agreed to that, and of course, we agreed to waiver of consent for the identified medical chart review and things like that, where you didn't know who the person was. So yes, we do have a section where we talk about that, because as we were shown yesterday by Professor Moodley, there are some patients who are in terrible condition on ventilators, they cannot speak. And so and then of course, families were not allowed to be inside the ICU, at least in our country. You were not allowed to come in, and the patient was essentially isolated. So it was really between the doctor and themselves. So it's a tricky situation, but there were some things that we really needed to find out. Some studies that came in that were asking good questions, and we agreed for waiver of consent in those circumstances. Thank you.
Dear Caroline, is this different from the situation before pandemic, or is it the same?
It's more or less the same as before the pandemic, but before the pandemic, it was very rare. It was very rare to get such a request. But after the pandemic, they were just coming in all the time. And we really had to look at it. So I'm also an RB, and a member of an RB for a hospital. And there were many, many such requests. And we had to deal with the whole issue of waiver of consent. So essentially, it just goes with what you do during emergencies, how you would behave during an emergency.
Thank you.
I definitely agree with Caroline that in such kind of situations, IRBs do allow some waiver kind of, and of course in our guidelines, we do adopt in national and international guidelines, and they all have that kind of aspect.
Thank you. Professor Clement, do you want to add something?
Yes, so I mean, so we have in South Africa, our national health law does require that written informed consent be obtained. But of course, as you've heard, there are exceptional circumstances. So what we did, as I mentioned, is we obtained independent physician consent in these situations, and potentially delayed consent from the participant or from family members at some point in time. So we have waived consent in cases which involve kind of audit situations. So you're not really working directly with the patients, you're rather auditing or collecting data related to symptoms and signs and treatment. So in those cases, you don't absolutely need written informed consent. And there we do consider or have granted waivers of consent in those situations.
Yeah, thank you. Dear panelists, do you have any situation when you agree about waiver of informed consent in case of clinical trials? When you have drugs?
Yes,
No,
for hello.
You go, sorry.
Hello. Yes, we do have during implementations of some of the clinical trials, for example, during labors, this kind of informed consent, of course, they are supposed to happen, but of course there are some other modalities where the participant get consented prior to the, to the getting into the labor, for example. But there are situations whereby, IRB do allow some, lifting of the waivers in the emergency situation. So I'm not sure whether I've responded it correctly, but there are circumstances.
Okay, in Kenya, in Kemri, let me say in Kemri, not in Kenya. In Kemri, in clinical trials, Dr. Slim, we tend to just have deferred consent, or at the beginning, as he said, if let's say for the children are very severely ill, the mother has come in, but they are eligible to be in a study. What we do at the first instance when we're talking to the mother or the person with the person or whoever is going to do the consenting is we get assent. We call it assent even if they're adults because they're not really in their right minds. They're they are anxious and we are not so sure why they are saying yes, because the situation is very tight. But then later on, we then go back again and said, okay, you had agreed for this, so now can we take you through? So what we have in clinical trials would be at best deferred consent, unless of course it was emergency, a clinical trial in an emergency situation, which happened now during COVID. But that's the way we go about it. So for clinical trials, it's just assent, or I would call it deferred consent. Thank you.
Yes, so it's a similar situation for us. We would have a deferred consent in extreme situations, or an independent physician consent. And later on, we would approach the participant to see if they want to, their data or information, or if they want to remain in the study going forward.
Thank you. Hani, I've just noticed, sorry, that Professor Godfrey has also got a comment. Professor Godfrey Tangwa, would you like to speak on this?
Yeah, hello. My question is to Dr. Penny. The last presentation that we had, if I understood you, your ethics committee was able to review about 30 protocols in 3 weeks. That would be an average of about 10 protocols a week. Now, with regard to expedited review, I think it is recommended for research that is minimal or of being expedited, it must not compromise quality. In other words, it needs to be as rigorous as it should. Now, looking back at the 30 protocols you approved in 3 weeks, is there anything that you think should have been done differently? Or do you really have the feeling that you were able to achieve the humanly impossible? Thank you.
Yes, so as I mentioned in the talk, we made sure that all ethics requirements were met. So from the information sheet to the consent process to the quality of the study to safety of patients. And in fact, I can say that we received great pressure from certain quarters about certain studies to hurry up and get the reviews through. I won't mention the name of the study, but it was a product or a drug that was withdrawn from COVID research. So I do believe we met all the standards. The review committee, as I said, worked extremely hard. We really worked exceptionally hard, having several meetings a week. There were lots of email exchanges. We were also helped by the consolidation of all the ethics committee chairs in South Africa. So, as I mentioned, where there was a study that was going to be carried out nationally, each one of the chairs or people related to that province reviewed that trial, and the comments were exchanged. So in that way, we were able to rapidly review important national trials. But I really don't believe we compromised in any way whatsoever. I believe that we've upheld all the standards, at times much to the annoyance of the researchers who thought they should get instant approval. just because it was a COVID trial. And a lot of people were quite upset when we insisted on, site permissions and hospital permissions and all of the regular requirements for an ethics approval. So I do believe we've upheld all of our standards in that time period.
So thank you very much, Prof. Penny, and thank you, Prof. Godfrey, for that question. I'm just going to read out, Dr. Hani, if that's okay, from the question and answer. We have a question here from Deogracius Wanya Rossi, and the question is, right now in Africa, people in our communities are afraid of unexisting vaccines against COVID-19, according to many messages from social media. How to help us to break these rumours, and can you share us your experiences, please, about community participation and informed consent to join trials? And others, for example, may like to join this. Prof. Godfrey, for example. Thank you, Prof. Hani.
Is this we can consider this a job of the REC or IRB, or it must be the job of the health authority? What is the regulation for this new vaccine? What type of research done before they approve it and give it for the people? I think it's out of the scope of the REC or IRB.
I just wonder if, because we're sort of moving towards as well, if thinking of overall discussion, I wonder if, Sarah, you have any comments on this question. Sarah Edwards?
Hello, I'm back. Sorry, I had to step out to another meeting, but I'm back. I'm so sorry to have missed the last sort of series of talks. I mean, it's a fantastic, topic. In terms of getting ethics approval in time. So I know that there's been quite a few discussions with WHO, AFRO, but in relation to the Ebola outbreaks in DRC over recent years. They were very keen to set up some kind of pre-approval or pre-positioned situation where even if they couldn't be granted full ethics approval for a particular project beforehand, the ethics committee would be well enough versed in a particular approach and a particular protocol to be able to review it really quite rapidly in an expedited way. I mean, with full-on emergencies, though, where you're starting from scratch, it's very difficult for scientists and medics and researchers generally to have protocols ready in advance. I mean, with the re-emerging infectious diseases, maybe, but for something like COVID, you're just going to be swamped. In London, the ethics committees have been swamped. I heard reference earlier to someone having to review 30 protocols in 3 weeks, I think it was. That's not unheard of over the past months in the UK. So much so that the ethics committees have had to extend their reach and co-opt members, or to have stand-in reviewers from other perhaps governance arrangements within the UK system. So co-opting from or redeploying from elsewhere. It does mean that clearly established and cohesive ethics committees might appear somewhat diluted or more stretched. These are all questions that we have no real answer to at the moment. This is just an attempt to manage what is clearly a surge in cases and a surge of research projects. Having been on a call with our patient and public involvement group, which is the UK version of community engagement, if you like, one of their points has been during the first say month or 2 months of really intense research activity, there was so much pressure on them simply to approve and to be able to tick a PPI box to move on to the next measure, the next hurdle, if you like, in the governance system, which was the ethics committee and sponsorship. It's only now that they have time to reflect on the projects that they've helped approve and to really examine what some of the issues were. We're of course now in a second surge in the UK. Research is ongoing. We're starting to get results from the first tranche of projects, and there are rolling calls for future projects. So we're kind of also learning as we go. The ethics committees, the extended and hopefully enhanced ethics committees, but who can tell, haven't yet been linked up with each other to have a sort of a shared discussion or a chance really to reflect on the experiences and the challenges that they've been facing beyond it simply being a resource issue and managing to meet the timelines that are clearly immensely challenging for all concerned.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Just going back then to some questions that we've got in the Q&A box, and if you have questions, do keep them coming. This is linking back, Prof. Hani and panel as well, to the review process and what Sarah's just been saying. A question from Kolawale Salami. And Kolawale's question is, how can we accelerate ethics and regulatory review process in Africa to facilitate research during epidemics? Because right now, most health systems in sub-Saharan Africa are not agile enough to allow for research in a rapidly evolving landscape of an outbreak. So would the panel like to address that question, please? Thanks.
Hi, this is Caroline from Cambridge. Quite simply, we just need to talk to each other. And I think Dr. Penny did talk about this earlier. I mean, there are just no two ways about it. We are, as secretariats, we are usually in contact with one another, and just as we become friends. And instead of insisting that we should do things sequentially rather, we should just agree that we'll do it at the same time. And I've often said it in my own country, that if we're having a joint proposal, we can just take, after all, we do quick turnaround and we do expedited. Get 3 people from one committee, 3 people from another, and 3 people from a third. So for our Oxford trial, vaccine trial with the Oxford vaccine, we had a pre-review meeting with the regulatory board as well. the Poisons and Pharmacy and Poisons Board. So we were 3 groups. There was the ethics committee, there were the scientists, and then there was the PPB. And we sat together and looked through the proposal even before it came for review, so that we could make the things go faster. So we pre-reviewed it. We agreed on some things between the PPB and KEMRI amongst the reviewers, and then they made the changes, and then it came back as a submission. And by that time, we had ironed out a lot of the issues. Not that more issues didn't come up, but at least we were on one page with the regulatory authority. So we must talk to each other. That's what we do. Just talk to each other and stop feeling very important for yourself. Agree that somebody else can review just as well as you, and review together. It's as simple as that. In as much as we try to say we are very unique and our populations are very unique, at the end of the day, the populations are human. The principles are more or less the same. Yes, they might not be applied in about the same way, and it can be done together. So that would be my response to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, because you preempted my response. Actually, in relation to the turnaround times, actually for the most of the regulation bodies, actually, you would need to get a certificate from each and every one. So for example, in Tanzania, when you are submitting a protocol to the ethical review board, then you really need to make pre-submission discussion prior to the actual submission. Because if you will submit to the National Institute for Medical Research, then you will also be supposed to submit it to the drug authority, for example. So if you set a meeting for this review board's members, then you would have already received some responses to update your protocol, so before it moves to the actual submission. So this is one way of making sure that the protocol receives the approvals on time. And also parallel submission is very important. For example, if you want to get your certificate as soon as possible and you are aiming to submit to the National Review Board, then at the same time you will need to submit to the drug authority as well, so that you get the approvals as early as possible. Thank you.
Sorry, Clement.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to put the ball back into the court of the applicants and say that, you know, if you provide us with all your documents up front, everything that you require to provide for the approval, that is going to speed things up immensely. So just imagine if your protocol is reviewed on the day of the ethics meeting, you actually get your certificate within 3 or 4 days of that meeting. So it works both ways, you know. It depends on the reviewers, the speed of the reviewers, the response from the ethics committee, and the response from the applicants. You know, sometimes applicants take a long time to respond. And then when they do respond, they expect an instant response from the ethics committee. So as I say, it works both ways. Both sides need to be aware of timelines and how long, you know, what documents are needed and response times. But just to go back to the COVID story and just explain a little bit more as to how we managed to review 30 applications in 3 weeks. This was because we could draw on a national committee of experts. We also have a local external review committee who do not, external experts who do not sit on our ethics review committee at all. They are outside reviewers, but they are experts in their field. They are experts in infectious diseases. And then we have an internal group of experts in infectious diseases. So in this way, we were able to work very hard and quite quickly to get the approvals through. And I agree again with Caroline. I think speaking to everybody across Africa, would have helped, or would help with future international studies or future international trials. That would have helped immensely if we could exchange review comments with one another.
Yes, and following up on that point, there are currently discussions with WHO, excuse me, it's not a COVID cough, whereby certain regulators, national regulators and certain ethics committees might agree to have reciprocal recognition of approvals in some cases where there's an exceptionally fast timeline. I mean, that certainly seems to make sense for those places. I mean, the African Union, you've now got, freedom of trade, freedom of movement across member states, as I understand it. So that sort of reciprocal agreement would seem to make sense, even if maybe you haven't got a sort of a federalized system as they have in the States, but it's certainly something that you might want to explore further. But yes, the more discussion, the better. And I'm really pleased that today, I'm hearing so many experiences from so many different places across Africa. So thank you.
Thank you, panel.
So maybe sorry, Mark, can I add another important things? One of the important things which I recently realized when I was doing my thesis was looking on the turnaround times. I found that most of the institutions which have electronic submissions actually are doing much better in comparison to those which do not have the electronic submission. So with the electronic submissions actually, which this, if all IRBs actually make use of the system, like Rhino and other systems for the submissions of the protocol, then this will make a difference in reducing the turnaround time.
I want to add something. We have a system of central REC or central IRB. We can activate this system in epidemics, like what happened in clinical trial in USA. In epidemic, we can have a central REC. If we have a multi-center inside the same country, we can review it in just one central REC instead of an institutional REC from different institutions. This will save a lot of time. And I wish to differentiate between fast track or accelerated review and expedited review, because expedited review and some definition mean just one or two reviewer review this research, and they is not accepted in clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. And what you've just been discussing actually reflects some of the questions that had come in the chat. There was one from Kofi Fosu asking if a clinical trial within a country during a pandemic is given an expedited review. Could that expedited review be replicated for intra-country trials? So a vaccine from country 1 being tested in country 2. I don't know whether the panel have any other comments on that.
Well, it might depend a little bit on the countries and what sort of reciprocal agreements, if any, there are. But certainly, where this can be facilitated, it sounds like a good idea. But I mean, your earlier point about what expedited review in fact entails, and what that means for different in different jurisdictions and for different committees, may raise itself all sorts of interesting questions. I mean, certainly ethics committees as they're fully constituted, they seem to vary in terms of membership, remit, roles. Sometimes there's a monitoring function, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's purely just reviewing paperwork. And certainly for some ethics committees in the UK, it was a case for a while of each individual simply reviewing the paperwork, submitting their comments to a chair who would then round up comments and approve or not. So it wasn't really a cohesive committee, and there wasn't anything like a consensus or any sort of deliberation. Now, clearly you might want to concentrate efforts where there's a lot of work to be done all at the same time, and you could have lead reviewers without relinquishing all responsibility on all of the members, but certainly to clarify exactly what's meant by expedited review in its technical sense, it seems to me to be crucial. I mean, I very often use the word expedite in much too much of a loose sense, just to mean speedy. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I think I can add to what Professor Edwards has just said. So again, as Hani Slim has said, and also Professor Edwards, we had to create a new terminology. So we do not expedite clinical trials. We do not do that. Expediting is for those that are not more than minimal risk. But we do quick turnaround. We had to create a new category called quick turnaround. And as I said, we could have as few as 3 people or as many as 10 or even 16, depending on the risk, because not all COVID-19 related trials were going to be clinical trials. There were some that were going to be more observational, some that were just different. So we would have a quick turnaround. And I do agree with Professor Edwards that the terminology, we have to agree what we mean on both sides of the border. So if it's Kenya and Uganda, we need to say, what is this? What do you call this? Do you call it quick turnaround, fast track? What is it? So that first of all, we're on the same page on that. And then now we can proceed to see how we are going to review it. But in one word, in Africa, one word, politics. Politics and more politics. So as technocrats, we tend to agree with each other very quickly. When our pandemic began, it was nuts, we knew what we wanted to do on the ground, but by the time it got to our Chief Secretary of Health, it was something totally different. And we had things with the fourth estate, which is the media, that didn't help, and have something splashed over the media. Kenyans are going to be used as guinea pigs. Oh my word. So even within our own families, even me, my own family, I had to I said, you guys have been doing this for the last 20 years. How dare you think like that? And I have to re-explain to them what it is we do. I have to re-explain the due process. So in everything, I think engagement is the most important thing. Unfortunately, we are not on the same level with the politicians. Politicians are in their own world. They're also in our own world. And there lies the difficulty. So in the end, we end up just doing sequential reviews because we can't get away from the politics. So we'll do ours in Kenya, they'll do theirs in Uganda, and we don't even know when the study will start. And we just do it that way because our hands are tied. So maybe the people we need to be training are the politicians, possibly. And the media, and the rest of us can work very well.
So,
thank you very much.
We are reached the end of this session. Thank all the presenter and the panelists. We are now having time for wrap up for the workshop. Thank you.
Hani, thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful session. Thank you for chairing very nicely, and thank you to our presenters there for very nice presentations and discussion. I was going to ask for a few remarks from Blessing, and then I was going to thank everyone and do a bit of a wrap up. Unfortunately, Blessing's connection seems to have dropped. He's actually in Zimbabwe at the moment. So Sarah, I wonder.
I'm back, Max.
Oh, you're
Sorry.
there, you're
Yeah,
back.
sorry. I've just turned off my video. I've just turned off my video because the internet is really unstable at the moment now.
Thank you. I couldn't see you in the chat. That's wonderful. Great. So
yeah, I kind of disappeared, but I'm happy to give closing remarks whilst the internet is still on.
Well, okay, right, over to you, and then I'll do a final wrap up. So over to you, Blessing. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone who participated in this workshop. I think it's been a really interesting and stimulating 2-day workshop. So we started our first day with 2 topics, really interesting. The first topic was around how to do research with vulnerable populations and how we could strengthen community engagement, for example, through the ethics review processes. So we had really stimulating and insightful presentations for panelists on that day. And we tried to highlight the importance of stakeholder and community engagement and how, for example, research ethics committees could also strengthen that community engagement. And then we moved to our second session, really, which tried to explore some of the challenges around informed consent, particularly during emergency contexts such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. And we had a really nice presentation from Professor Kim Mantri-Modley, who really highlighted some of the challenges of consent in a pandemic situation. Today was also an equally interesting and stimulating day with 2 topics. Our first session was around biobanking, and we had a very nice presentation from Amini Yakubu, who really highlighted comprehensively some of the ethical and governance challenges in doing research with biobanks, particularly around ethical issues such as what appropriate consent should be used for, when you ask participants to donate their samples and you're asking them to consent for future research, sometimes which they do not know or which they might not even agree with. So what's the appropriate consent model to use in that case? He also highlighted the issue of, fair collaboration, because most of the biobanking research initiatives take place in the context of international collaborations. There's a lot of transnational collaborations between the global south and the global north, and also between, amongst global south countries such as South Africa, maybe in Uganda, Nigeria, particularly with the H3 Africa Biobank, which was set up across about 4 or 5 different African countries. It raises a lot of issues also about how do we ensure that while we need robust ethics and governance frameworks, we also want to promote research. You don't want to stifle biobanking research. So we need to create and strike that balance between, coming up with ethics and regulatory frameworks that protect participants, but at the same time, we don't want to be too restrictive with our ethics and governance framework. So there is that need for striking an appropriate balance. And obviously, we wrapped up our session with a very interesting panelists who shared their different perspectives from different African countries on ethics review during pandemics. Ethics review is such a key component of protecting participants involved in research. And as such, it was really important that we sort of wrap up this session with conversations from people who sit on ethics committees, people who service these ethics committees, so administrators, secretariats, and all the people really who are involved in the ultimate goal of trying to ensure that even in times such as the current COVID-19 pandemic, we have a moral obligation to conduct ethically robust and scientifically robust research. So I'm really excited about all the presentation that we had yesterday and today. And I think that was a very fruitful discussion. Just a note that we have created on our Pandora website an ethics hub where some of these discussions can still be taken ahead. If you have questions or if you want to post anything that you think could warrant a discussion amongst all the attendees, feel free to have a look at it and post and just continue the conversations with the ultimate goal of ensuring that in Africa, we strive for ethical research, even in emergent situations such as the COVID-19 and other future unknown outbreaks. So yeah, I want to again thank you, all of you, and I'm going to hand over now to Max. Max, over to you.
Hi, Blessing. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you for that. Wonderful. So as Blessing was just saying, we'll put a link, I think, in the, perhaps you can put a link now for the Pandora Knowledge Sharing Hub on the Global Health Network. Pandora does also have a website, which you're very welcome to look at, but within the Knowledge Sharing Hub, that's where you're going to find this workshop when it's put up online. That's where you're going to find the Ethics Hub. It'll have lots of links, lots of resources. And as Blessing said, that's where you can also find discussion fora. So let's keep those discussions going through that hub. We also recommend to you to just evaluate yourself of the Global Health Network. It's got a very rich source of resources there. So thanks very much, Blessing. Just to remind everyone, we will be sending you an evaluation form. That is mandatory, I'm afraid, in order for you to get your certificate of attendance. That's how it works. It doesn't take very long. It helps us then to improve the quality of our future workshops. And then you'll be getting your certificate, should be sent to you probably sometime early in the new year. And I think that, thanks, Blessing, I think you've covered pretty much all the thank yous. Wonderful presentations and discussions, and particularly thanks, for example, to Prof. Penny for stepping in at the last moment with a great talk and discussion there when somebody had to drop out. So thank you for that. Thanks too for facilitators. So Sarah, Leah today, for all the facilitation and participation, and for chairing, of course. That's a great job being done today by Ames and Hanny. We thank you for that. Of course, we mustn't forget the Global Health Network, who do this so professionally, very slick. We thank you so much for everything there. So particularly today to Bonnie, to Helena, to Heather. Thank you for another very professional workshop. I'd also like to thank Lindsay Elton here at UCL for all her help, as ever, making things run smoothly with all the work up for this and in the background. So thanks to everybody. And obviously the final thank you has got to go to Blessing. Blessing has done a fantastic job of putting together this workshop. So I hope everybody's going to do a big woo, Macaroto, in your respective places, because he's done a wonderful job. He's very well connected, I've realised, and knows lots of people. And Blessing, a big thank you to you for putting together this wonderful programme. So everybody, we'll close now. Thanks so much. We look forward to seeing you next year when we have more workshops. So we look forward to participating with you then. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Bye now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.